Welcome back, brothers, to Warlord. Tonight's story, we got two of the period's most brutal chapters. Before we get into madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. And I want to thank you guys for support. I'll be killing it. Now, let's get to the video.
Vulgaris burned like a world already condemned. Its skies had not shown their natural color in months. They were a vault of ash and blood, split again and again by the white lash of macro artillery, by the crawling green glare of void shields over distant hives, by the furnace breath of ruptured refineries, and by the red auroras that bled from wounds in the firmament where reality had thinned. Every horizon burned. Every sea had become a sump of chemical slime, cinder, and corpse fat runoff. The hive spires of Carthax rose through the storm like blackened needles, their upper reaches wreathed in smoke and lit from within by fire. Beneath them, factorum districts still labored without cease, because the dead were not merely piling in the streets now. They had become fuel. Lieutenant Merrick Voss of the Vulgaris line had seen that with his own eyes. The trench belts outside Hive Carthax were less a defensive line than a continent-spanning grave being dug in real time. Mud lay thick in every communication trench, though it was not true mud anymore. It was trench water, pulverized ash, blood, spilled promethium, human waste, and the black grease washed down from the war engines dying a few hundred meters beyond the wire. Men sank to the knee in it. Men drowned in it when shell concussions cast them face first. Men vanished in it under the tracks of retreating carriers, and the ground swallowed them with a sound like a wet mouth closing. Voss crouched beneath the lip of a collapsed firing step, while mortar fragments whined overhead and clattered from the rusted plating stacked along the trench wall. His rebreather was clogged with soot. His greatcoat was so drenched in mud and blood that it dragged at his shoulders like a burial shroud. He had not slept in 2 days. He had forgotten what clean air smelled like. He could still remember the stink of Vulgaris before the invasion, of forge smoke and hot iron, and the acid tang of manufactorum vents. He would have traded half his remaining life to breathe that air again. A runner stumbled down the trench, slipping twice before crashing into the revetment beside him. "Lieutenant," the trooper gasped, "the left curtain wall is gone. The 19th are pulling back from Bastion Theta." "They are dead then," Voss said. The runner stared at him through lenses filmed white with grime. He was young enough to still look shocked when men spoke plainly. "Lieutenant?" Voss checked the charge pack on his last pistol, though he already knew it was half drained. Habit had outlived hope. If they are pulling back in daylight under those guns, they are dead. If they stay, they are dead slower. Either way, Bastion Theta is lost. He looked up the trench line. "Tell Major Wren that if he wants this section held, he sends ammunition, not prayers." The runner hesitated. Somewhere out in the red fog, a battery of enemy siege guns opened fire. The earth convulsed. Men ducked on. Instinct, though there was nowhere to go. A heartbeat later, the world ahead of the trench line vanished behind a wall of black earth and orange fire. "Go," Voss snapped. The runner went. A corporal beside him laughed once, a thin, cracked sound. "You hear that, sir? Ammunition, not prayers." Voss looked at him. Corporal Huldren had lost 2 fingers on his left hand, the flesh boiled from the stumps by a near miss from a plasma burst 3 days before. The hand was wrapped in dirty bandages that seeped yellow through the cloth. He still held his long lars steady enough to kill with it. "What did I say about mockery, Corporal? That it is a sin when priests hear it, and a virtue when they do not." Voss almost smiled. Almost. "Then keep your virtue quiet." They peered through a slit cut in the stacked armor plates ahead of them. Beyond the wire, the battlefield stretched out in broken ridges of shell craters, shredded hab-block rubble, and burned-out armor. Hulks. It had once been the outer manufactorum district of Carthax. Conveyor causeways still spanned the blasted earth in places, but now they hung broken and sagging, heavy with the dead. On some, the corpses had been arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. 8-pointed stars, circles, long strips of flayed skin twisting in the hot wind like devotional pennants. Not for the first time, Voss forced his gaze away. There were no civilians in the front anymore, not living ones. The bloodreapers had seen to that. They did not storm districts merely to conquer them. They took them intact. Whole population blocks vanished behind advancing curtains of chainmail, traitor armor, and red-armored madmen. Then came the silence. Then came the stink. When Imperial scouts or servo skulls later breached those districts, they found the hab towers emptied room by room, families dragged into plazas and transit stations that had been turned into hanging slaughterhouses. Chains, descended from gantries and hab cranes. Men, women, and children had been strung upside down in rows and bled into collection cisterns, while robed heretics chanted litanies to the blood god, and the great pumps throbbed, sending the harvested blood down through pipework not marked on any city schematic. Into the deep places, the engine seers said, into the hive's buried heart. Voss had believed none of it until his regiment was ordered to counter-attack into Sump District 9. He had seen the chain-hung abattoir there. He had seen the blood cisterns, each large as a chapel nave. He had seen a factorum furnace fed not with promethium drums, but with conveyor wagons piled high with stripped corpses. The dead burned down for heat and grease, so the slaughter lines could remain operational when the city's own fuel arteries failed. Vulgaris was not merely being invaded, it was being rendered. A voice crackled over the trench vox, drowning in static and distant screams. All line. Commands. All line commands. Enemy advance in Sector Primus through Sextus. Hold positions by authority of Hive Command. Repeat. Hold positions by authority of Hive Command. Huldron spat into the mud. Hive Command. Hive Command is still alive, Voss said. For now. For now. Everything ended with that now. A shriek rolled across the wasteland then, so high and ragged it cut through artillery thunder. Not a shell, not a machine. Men along the trench line flinched and clutched at their helmets as the sound rose again, and with it came movement in the red murk ahead. They're coming, Huldron said. They were. At first Voss saw only shapes in the smoke, thick silhouettes advancing between firebursts, too heavy for men, too purposeful for beasts. Then the artillery glare limned them clearer. Traitor Astartes in armor the color of fresh arterial blood. Ranks of mortal thralls in iron masks and chainmail aprons. Engines walking on piston limbs. Skin banners. Icons of brass. Behind them all, rolling forward like a procession from the oldest nightmares of mankind, came the siege altars of the bloodreapers, their wheels crushing the dead into the mud, while chained captives screamed from cages hanging beneath them. Steady, Voss said. Steady, let them into range. The first wave hit the wire, and detonations rippled across the killing field as buried mines blew men into rags. Heavy bolters from the line opened up, their bark a brutal counterpoint to the deeper thunder of the guns behind. Lasfire slashed the murk in red sheets. Bodies burst, toppled, vanished. It did not matter. The blood reapers came on through the ruin of their own dead, stepping over dismembered thralls and split torsos without pause, and the thing at their center walked with them as though every shell burst broke around the invisible sphere of his will. Vorgath Koul. Even before Voss knew the name, he knew the being was no mere berserker chieftain. The Chaos Lord strode through shellfire in ancient warplate of crimson and blackened brass, his armor layered in kill trophies and parchments of flayed skin. A cloak of chain links dragged behind him, and from those chains hung severed hands, jawless skulls, the broken aquilers torn from loyalist breastplates, and strips of skin inked with prayers that had failed their bearers. His helm was crested by curving horns of dark iron, but the faceplate was no snarling beast mask. It was colder than that. It was a war mask shaped like a death's head, its expressionless brutality made worse by the eyes, two furnace-red embers that seemed to regard the battlefield not with fury, but with calculation. He moved as if he already owned every inch of ground before him. Around him, men died with purpose, not wastefully, not in frenzy, with purpose. "Emperor, preserve us," whispered someone further down the trench. Koul raised one gauntlet, and as if a signal had passed through the marrow of his host, the bombardment shifted. Enemy guns ceased battering the trench line and instead began hammering the rearward roads, the medici stations, the ammunition pits. Voss understood at once. They were sealing the line. No retreat, no reinforcement, no escape. Death, contained and managed. Industry. A squad of heavy infantry from the Vulgaris 19th rose from a reserve trench to Voss's right, their carapace armor black with grime, their heavy stubber teams already firing from the hip as they charged to block the breach opening in the wire. Ogrin auxiliaries thundered with them, huge and roaring, ripper guns shaking in their fists. For one mad instant, Voss believed sheer weight might do it. The Ogrins hit first, smashing traitor thralls apart, breaking bodies in sprays of shattered bone and red mud. A heavy stubber stitched rounds across Koul's chest, and sparks flew from the Chaos Lord's plate. Koul did not even break stride. He moved through the countercharge like a blade through wet cloth. His weapon was an axe in one hand and a chain hook in the other, though weapon seemed too small a word for either thing. The axe head glowed with internal heat, its edge black with old blood. The chain hook whirred and spat sparks as its teeth bit the air. An Ogrin bodyguard reached him first, a colossal brute with a slab shield welded to one forearm and devotion stamped into the bones of his face. The abhuman bellowed and brought the shield down in a blow that would have broken a light transport in half. Koul caught it one-handed, not slowed, not staggered, caught it. Then, with contemptuous ease, he drove the chain hook through shield, arm, ribcage and spine in one shrieking spray. The Ogrin's roar became a bubbling groan. Koul tore the hook free sideways, opening the giant from shoulder to hip. Entrails and shattered ribs spilled steaming into the mud. Before the body had struck the ground, Koul split the head of a second heavy infantryman with the axe and stamped a third man down so hard that Voss heard the neck break even over the guns. The reserve charge collapsed at once, not because the men were cowards, because human courage had a natural end and monsters like that stood beyond it. "Fire!" Voss shouted. "Fire, damn you all, fire!" The trench answered him. Laser guns cracked, stubbers hammered. A missile screamed overhead and burst amid a knot of traitor marines, showering them in flame. Koul turned his helm toward Voss's line, as if he had heard the lieutenant personally. Across that distance, through smoke and shell bursts, Voss felt the weight of the warlord's regard settle on him. He knew then that men like Koul were more dangerous than madmen. Madmen could be baited, broken, made to blunder. This thing was lucid. This thing measured screams like quotas. A Vox servitor clanked into the trench behind Voss, dragged by a bloodied signalman. Its speaker grill hissed. "Line command. New directive from rear. Echelon. Officers from the 9th and 22nd surrendered during the collapse of bastions Theta and Iota. Enemy Vox broadcast incoming." Static shrieked. Then a new voice rolled across every trench channel in the sector, amplified and iron calm. It was Koul. "Look upon your commanders," he said. The signalman fumbled with the picked slate slotted into the servitor's chest. The image jittered into life. Men crowded despite themselves. Voss wished he had not. The captured officers of the 9th and 22nd hung from iron frames erected just beyond the old transit interchange. They had been flayed from throat to ankle, their skin peeled back in great wet banners that swayed and dripped from hooks driven through their shoulders. Some still lived. Their mouths worked soundlessly. Their exposed musculature gleamed darkly in the furnace light. Behind them knelt more prisoners waiting their turn, while robed slaughter priests daubed sigils in the pooling blood. Koul's voice continued, hard as a forge hammer. Let every bastion see what loyalty purchases. Let every commander hear what surrender earns. Yield your sectors, and I shall skin you alive before your men. Resist, and I shall do the same after I have fed them to the engines. No one in the trench spoke. Somewhere a man began retching into his rebreather. The picked feed died. Voss realized his teeth were clenched so hard his jaw hurt. Huldren muttered a prayer that was half curse. "Lieutenant," the corporal said softly, "if they break through here, they do not take us alive." Huldren nodded once. That, at least, needed no explanation. Far to the rear of the line, beyond the trench maze and the reserve emplacements, beyond even the hive wall itself, the towers of the Sanctum Astra Telepathica still rose above Carthax like pale bones. For weeks, the astropathic choir within had screamed messages into the void until their minds bled through their eyes, and their keepers had to lash them to their chairs. Many had burned out. Many had begun speaking in voices not their own. Yet still, they had sent help requests, distress catechisms, coordinates, casualty loads, pleas to Terra, to Segmentum Command, to any ship, any station, any loyal soul that might hear. In the highest chamber of the sanctum, where incense fought a losing war against the stench of fear and blood, the surviving choir sent one final cry. Choir Master Helicon, blind since childhood, and now blind in worse ways besides, leaned into the brass mouth of the transmitter throne until blood ran from his nose and ears in threads. Around him, his fellow astropaths convulsed in their restraint harnesses, their lips moving in fevered synchrony. "Vulgaris endures," Helicon whispered, though his voice came layered with a dozen others. "By the throne, let someone hear. Hive Carthax under extinction assault. Rift instability increasing. Civilian death beyond tally. The foe is at the gates. We beg immediate." The chamber doors imploded inward. Bronze crashed. Stone burst. Cold fire raced across the floor in veins of impossible light. Through the smoke came horned things and red-armored killers, their axes wet, their laughter inhuman. One astropath burst where he sat, his flesh flowering outward in a rain of blood and burning nerve tissue. Another screamed as a demon's talon punched through his chest and lifted him into the air, spine dangling. Helicon did not stop speaking until a traitor blade took his head off at the jaw. Outside, on the trench line, Voss knew none of that. He knew only the guns, the mud, the bodies piling in the wire, and the sky above Vulgaris beginning to change. At first, he thought a new bombardment had begun. The ash cloud ceiling far overhead trembled with distant light. Then came contrails, not falling shells, not meteors. Too many, too controlled. Great streaks of white fire punched down through the upper atmosphere, burning tunnels. In the black cloud layer, something vast moved behind them, hidden and revealed by turns as the furnace glow caught adamantine hulls. Ships, void ships. Even the men around him understood at once. A sound passed through the trench that he had not heard in weeks. Hope. "Look," Huldren breathed. Through a rent in the smoke, Voss saw the silhouettes more clearly now, descending toward high anchor over the burning world. Imperial prows, gun batteries, armored flanks bright with re-entry fire. One warship bore a vast predatory shape at its prow, like the head of some Fenrisian beast cast in iron and gold. Another came behind it, leaner, darker, blade-like and red as a fresh wound beneath the flames. Men began making the sign of the Aquila. Some laughed, some wept. One old trooper sank to his knees in the mud and whispered, "We are saved." Voss stared upward through the ash and falling embers as the ships drove lower, and for the first time in many days, he felt the dead weight on his chest lift. Help had come to Vulgaris at last. He did not yet know what kind. The fleet of Fenris came in hard. There was no stately emergence from the Empyrean, no measured parade of blessed hulls gliding into formation beneath banners and vox-chanted honors. The ships of the Great Wolf broke from the warp like hunting beasts scenting blood, their prows already angled toward the dying world, their auger masts drinking in the ruin of Vulgaris with machine speed and old hunger. Battle barges, strike cruisers, and escort wolves of adamantine and fire slid through the outer dark, while their engines burned blue and white against the ash-smeared void. Around them rode Imperial Navy vessels, seconded to the task force, sober gunships and line cruisers bearing the Aquila and the long discipline of fleet command. They looked almost fragile beside the ships of the Vulca Fenrica. Almost. On the command deck of his flagship, Logan Grimnar stood in the half-dark before the hololithic war display and watched a world die. Vulgaris spun below in a bruise of rust, fire, and poisoned cloud. The upper atmosphere was laced with weapons discharge. Orbital docks burned in layers, some already broken open and venting crews into the void in glittering streams of frozen corpses. Vox traffic screamed through the command pit in overlapping tongues, naval cant, astropathic echo, machine binharic, the clipped panic of officers drowning under too much data and too little time. The hololith above the strategium dais pulsed and flickered as new kills, new breach points, and new enemy ident marks bled across its ghost-light surface. Grimnar needed only moments. He did not pace. He did not roar. He did not speak until the whole chamber had fallen silent enough to hear the low grind of his armor servos as he leaned slightly toward the display. The old warrior's face was harsh in the pallid light, one eye cold and watchful, the other lost long ago and replaced by something harder. His mane of grey hair hung to his shoulders like a lion pelt turned human. Nothing theatrical clung to him, nothing forced. He had no need of borrowed majesty. It lived in the stillness with which he judged the abyss. "The world is already inside the kill cage," he said. That was all. No one mistook the weight of it. A naval commodore in void black uniform, his breast hung with medals no one on that deck cared to count, cleared his throat carefully. "Lord Grimnar, we are still collating the full astropathic record. With respect, prudent engagement doctrine would suggest a wider survey of the orbital picture before committing the task force. There are too many unknowns." One of the wolf guard near the dais snorted. Another bared his teeth in something that was not a smile. Grimnar did not look at the Commodore. His gaze remained on the hololith, on the ghostly red bands marking the surface bombardment lines and the darker clusters denoting traitor. Warships sheltering above the planet's inner stations. "If you wait to know a kill before you strike," he said, "the kill belongs to something faster than you." The Commodore stiffened. "My lord, there are still loyal personnel aboard several of the orbital plates. There may yet be evacuees, wounded, command stores, munitions. There are also beacon arrays broadcasting slaughter liturgies into the lower atmosphere." Grimnar lifted one gauntleted hand and pointed at a tumbling orbiter fortress hanging above the northern hemisphere. "That plate is corrupted. It is drawing fire lanes down onto the hive belts and acting as a signal pyre for the enemy beneath it. It dies first." An officer of the fleet stepped forward from the auger station. "My lord, Auspex confirms substantial life signs aboard the plate." "Human?" "Yes, lord." "Uncorrupted?" The officer faltered. That hesitation answered the question. Grimnar turned his head then, not sharply, but enough that the command deck seemed to contract around him. "Scuttle it." The Commodore took one step forward before his caution overcame his rank. "My lord, there could be thousands aboard." "There are." Grimnar's voice did not rise. It became colder. "Thousands already offered to the enemy, or about to be. If that plate remains where it hangs, it will guide the foe's guns for another hour and kill tens of thousands more below. If it falls burning into the upper atmosphere, it will blind their auger net and break the pattern of their kill signals. You count the condemned on a station. I count the living on a world." The silence that followed was hard and ugly. Then the Commodore bowed his head. "As you command." Grimnar gave a single nod. No triumph lived in him, no relish. Ruthlessness and joy were not kin, no matter what frightened men told themselves about wolves. Cruelty in service to necessity was still cruelty. He knew that. He simply had no room left in him for lies that made men comfortable while worlds burned. Through the primary viewing shield, the orbital plate died under concentrated lance fire from the fleet. White beams struck its shield envelope until the void around it ran molten with energy bleed. The first salvo cracked its spine, the second gutted it. A moment later, the fortress broke into spinning, burning slabs, its atmosphere venting in a vast white plume that became a fan of glittering ice and human remains. The debris field fell toward Vulgaris in streaks of fire. Somewhere below, whatever had been aboard the plate died with it. No one on the flagship spoke of them again. The war opened itself in the same breath. Enemy escorts broke from behind the burning docks, traitor raiders and blasphemous gunships painted in old blood colors, their hulls thick with brass growths, shrine spikes and weapon mouths. Vox traffic from the hostile vessels came as howls and hammered catechisms, targeting runes, flared across the hololith. Alarms began to pulse in slow, crimson rhythm through the command deck. Grimnar drew a breath through his fangs and said, "Now we strike." Orders flew. The Space Wolves fleet did not unfurl into textbook formations. It lunged. Strike cruisers rolled inward on attack vectors that would have made a Scholam Tactica instructor choke on his own outrage. Escorts broke in pairs, hunting by instinct and battlecraft rather than parade ground precision. Thunderhawks launched in shoals. Boarding torpedoes hurled from launch bays like iron spears. The Navy captains accompanying the Wolves muttered prayers to the throne and adjusted their own lines as best they could around the Fenrisians' savagery. The Wolves laughed over the Vox as they armed themselves. "Oath taken," growled one pack leader as his men sealed their helms. "Save me a traitor worth remembering," answered another. "I will," came the reply, "if you are quick enough to keep up." That drew a burst of coarse amusement over the pack channel. Grimnar heard it all as he walked toward the launch chamber with his chosen wolf guard at his back. Their battle banter rolled through the Vox, not as levity alone, but as pact and rhythm, the speech of warriors who had bled together so often that words themselves had become part of war gear. They mocked because fear had no rightful seat among them. They boasted because the saga of a kill began before the blade bit. They honored death because every warrior of Fenris knew he carried his ending with him from the hour he first swore himself to Russ and the All-Father. A Navy captain intercepted the great wolf at the embarkation threshold, pale-faced behind the brass of his rebreather collar. "My lord, with respect, your place is here. We have boarding elements enough. There is no need for you to risk yourself in a breach action." Grimnar looked at him as one might look at a dog that had barked from honest concern, but forgotten its place. "If I send my sons into the Red Moor while I stand behind shields and relay stations, then I am not fit to rule them. My lord, the risk to command cohesion if you are slain is unacceptable." Grimnar's one good eye narrowed. "Then pray I am not slain." He pushed past and entered the Thunderhawk. The assault craft bucked as it tore free of the flagship and burned toward the nearest enemy escort, a butchered-looking vessel riding close protective screen over the inner dockyards. Lances and macro shells crossed the void around it in bars of white and orange. Debris clanged from the gunship's hull. Inside the troop hold, the Wolf Guard stood easy in maglocks, one hand on weapon hafts, the other clenched around grab bars. Frost axes, chain blades, storm shields, melter guns. Their armor was scarred, ruined, pelts hanging from their shoulders, fang talismans clicking softly with every impact. None of them spoke now. The kill was too close. The Thunderhawk rammed into the enemy hull behind a wave of boarding torpedoes. Charges blew. The breach became a sun-bright wound. Grimnar was first through it. He came into a corridor drowned in red warning light and stinking of hot metal, scorched insulation, and old blood. The first traitor crewmen died before they understood what had hit them, their bodies broken by bolt rounds and axe strokes at breath range. Then came the true defenders, red-armored warriors marked by Khorne and old heresy, their helmets snarling, chain axes revving as they charged into the smoke. The corridor narrowed to murder. Fenrisian blades rose and fell in the strobing light. Bolt pistols boomed. A melter-gun washed a hatchway in white fire, reducing ceramite and flesh alike to bubbling ruin. Grimnar crashed into the center of the enemy knot like a storm-made man. His axe tore the first traitor's shoulder and helm away in one blow. He slammed the second into the wall hard enough to cave the plating, then buried steel in the throat seal of a third before the corpse had finished falling. He fought without waste, every movement kingly in the oldest sense, not refined, not elegant, but absolute. Around him, his guard matched that ferocity with pack discipline, each warrior covering the next, shouldering through steam and blood, advancing in snarling lockstep. Further aft, another boarding pack reported the seizure of the escort's lance control deck. Another had taken the engine shrine. A third was still fighting room to room near the bridge and laughing while they did it. Grimnar reached the central armor lock and planted his boot against the sundered corpse of the enemy champion, barring it. He keyed the vox. "Bridge is mine. Seal the other arteries. No blood escapes this hull." The answering growls were eager and immediate. The final breach came under concentrated enemy fire. Heavy rounds tore chips from the bulkheads. One Wolfguard spun and dropped to one knee. Breastplate punched inward, yet he rose again through sheer hatred and charged on. Grimnar took the shield wall personally, slamming into it beneath a hail of detonating bolts. His guard followed so close that they nearly climbed one another's shoulders. The armor lock blew inward. The bridge beyond became a chamber of smoke, broken screens and screaming sirens. When it was done, the traitor vessel was theirs. Out in the void, more kills burned. Above Vulgaris, the scuttled remains of the orbital plate fell in long, incandescent scars through the atmosphere. On the surface, men in trenches and shattered bastions saw those streaks, and then saw more following. Not wreckage now, but descent fire. Thunderhawks, dropcraft, orbital insertion trails cutting the blood-red heavens into slashes of white and blue. Lieutenant Merrick Voss, crouched in the ruins of a trench redoubt outside Hive Carthax, heard the change in the war before he understood it. The loyalist Vox channels, so long, choked with panic and static, suddenly filled with new traffic. Not polished fleet cant, not the cracked pleas of dying guard officers. Deeper voices, harsh voices. Fenrisian war cants thundered across the net in clipped bursts and howling battle oaths. Gunships screamed low over the trench lines, engines beating the ash clouds aside as they went. Men looked up from blood and mud and saw iron shapes descending through fire like the wrath of old gods. Someone in the trench began to laugh. Someone else shouted, "The Astartes! The Emperor sends his wolves!" Voss did not speak. He only stared as one squadron of gunships banked over the burning plains and fell toward the enemy's rear lines with murder written in engine flame. Myth had entered the war. Hours later, with the first void engagement still raging above the world, Logan Grimnar stood in a bunker beneath the inner curtain wall of Carthax and attended the first Ground Command Council. The chamber had once belonged to some manufactorum overseer or guild factor. Now it stank of burned circuitry, incense and men who had not taken their armor off in too long. Guard generals stood around the hololithic table with the rigid faces of the nearly broken. Navy liaison officers watched the great wolf as men watched a weapon that might save them or kill them for standing in its path. Grimnar listened in silence, while casualty totals, breach maps, ammunition deficits, and district losses were recited. He cut away excuses with a word. He ignored ceremony altogether. When a general began speaking of civic symbols and the political necessity of retaking some half-ruined transit cathedral before the outer gun lines, Grimnar ended him with a look. "We retake what kills the foe," he said. "Stone and pride can wait." No one argued. Then an Auspex, adept in Mechanicus Red, suddenly stiffened over his station. "My lords," he rasped. "New translation signature at system edge. Rapid approach. Astartes. Pattern. 1 strike cruiser. Several escort returns uncertain in ash and interference." Grimnar turned toward the hololithic projector as the new rune blazed into existence. The vessel tore into real space in a smear of violent red light, as though the wound of translation itself had bled. Its profile was lean and predatory, painted the color of fresh spilled blood beneath the system glare. Heraldries flashed across the Auspex rune as machine spirits and cogitators matched ancient records. A blood drop, a saw-toothed wing, the mark of the flesh-tearers. One of the Wolfguard gave a low, displeased growl. Another bared his fangs. Grimnar said nothing for a moment. His one eye stayed fixed on the crimson icon burning above Vulgaris, and the officers around him mistook his stillness for calm. It was not calm. It was judgment. Gabriel Seth stood in the arming chamber and listened to his warship breathe. Every vessel had a soul. The priests of Mars called it a machine spirit, and larded the term with enough incense and sanctimony to choke a shrine. But Seth had lived too long inside battle barges and strike cruisers not to know the simpler truth. A warship that had carried a chapter through centuries of void war became a thing with memory. It learned the footfall of its masters. It learned the taste of blood vented through ruptured decks. It learned the strain of overworked reactors, the grinding protest of armor plates battered by macro shells, the low animal moan of hull stress under turn and acceleration. It remembered the dead. It remembered the damned. The warship knew its masters now. It knew the flesh-tearers. It knew hunger. Red lumen strips burned along the chamber walls, throwing iron shadows across weapon racks and serried rows of waiting warriors. No one wasted words. Chainswords purred while their teeth were tested. Magazines locked into bolters with hard metallic snaps. Armor seals hissed. Purity parchments fluttered in the recirculated air, stained by old oil and older blood. The brothers of the flesh-tearers stood in silence, or spoke in low, short exchanges that were not conversation so much as the final alignment of intent before murder. They were never like the wolves, Seth thought. He had fought beside the sons of Fenris before. He knew their way of war, knew the laughter before the charge, and the easy boasts cast back and forth like blades honed in good humor. The flesh-tearers had none of that. There was no open mirth here, no broad theatrics. Their humor, when it surfaced at all, was dry as bone and twice as bitter. Their tempers rode closer to the skin. Their restraint was not natural ease. It was discipline hauled tight over something with claws. That truth lived in every one of them. It lived in Seth most of all. He was tired in the way only the Adeptus Astartes could understand, not bodily fatigue alone, but the accumulated drag of too many campaigns fought too close together, too many dead stacked. Behind his eyes, too many brothers buried, burned, entombed or lost to the darkness in the blood. The attrition of the chapter lay in him like an old wound. It did not cripple. It did not soften. It simply never stopped aching. He stood broader than most of his warriors, a slab of ceramite, scar tissue, and sheer unyielding malice shaped into a lord of war. His armor was the color of fresh spilled blood, darkened by ash. His chainsword hung at his side, its teeth caked with residue scrubbed, but never fully removed. His face was hard and lean, all angles and old damage, every line carved deeper by wrath held under command. A serf approached, head bowed, carrying a fresh data slate in both hands, as though it were a sacred offering. Seth took it, read in silence, and crushed the slate in one gauntlet until it snapped, and its broken innards snapped, and its broken innards spilled to the deck. "Vulgaris is worse than the first cry claimed," he said. No one asked how much worse. That question was for lesser men. Chaplain Apollos stood a few paces away in his black war plate, the skull helm maglocked to his hip for now. Without it, his face looked carved from old parchment and bad memories. He had the stillness of a grave marker. "The astropathic choir?" Apollos asked. "Mostly dead. The survivors are foaming their minds into knots trying to hold the veil shut over Hive Carthax." Seth looked toward the Strategium bulkhead, as if he could see through it to the war below. "The bloodreapers are not raiding. They are building." One of the veteran sergeants, Castor, turned his helm slightly. "A throne of skulls." "A machine made of slaughter," Seth said. "Which is worse. Madmen can be broken by their own folly. Builders have to be killed piece by piece." He began to walk, and the chamber opened around him as brothers stepped aside. He had not come to Vulgaris for glory. He had not come because a burning forge world cried out, and his heart swelled at the thought of saving it. He had come because there was war here enough to feed his chapter for a time, and if the flesh-tearers were not spent against the enemies of mankind, sooner or later they would spend themselves against something they had no right to kill. Seth knew that, with an intimacy bordering on disgust. He knew what lived beneath the discipline, beneath the litanies, beneath the constant grinding work of command. The hunger had to be pointed outward. It had to be kept busy. Idle blades cut the hand that held them. He would drown his chapter in worthy blood before he let it drown in its own curse. The shipmaster's voice came over the chamber vox. "Enemy vessel identified on intercept. Hull mass consistent with heavy transport or slaughter barge. Minimal escort screen. Bearing altered to reinforce the inner orbital kill zone." Seth keyed his helm rune. "Name it." A pause. Then, "Designation unknown, Lord. The hull is layered in scrap armor and shrine growth. Thermal readings excessive. Large biomass signatures in the lower decks. Possible prisoner holds." A slaughter barge, then. Not a warship built for honorable void battle, but a hauling carcass used to ferry captives, butchers, ammunition, demon bait, and whatever else these vermin needed to keep their gore engines running. Seth felt something inside him settle into place. "Prepare boarding torpedoes and assault craft," he said. "We take that ship before we descend." Castor gave a single approving nod. Apollos said nothing. He needed no explanation. Grimnar might fall on the world like a storm and start unpicking the larger pattern of the war with wolf cunning. That was his way. Seth's was simpler. There was prey within reach. It would die first. The launch sirens began to sound. The flesh-tearers moved without haste and without wasted motion. Helmets locked into place. Battle brothers struck warding signs onto breastplates with blooded thumbs. Chainswords revved once, twice, then fell still again in hands that did not tremble. Through the launch bay, blast shutters, Seth saw the void beyond, black and cold and full of distant fire. Vulgaris turned below in wounded majesty. The enemy barge crawled across the near dark like a tick fattened on plague. Seth entered his boarding torpedo last. The interior was iron, restraint bars, and red lumens. His warriors mag-locked around him in silence. The launch cradle clamped. Rites were intoned by the machine crew outside. Somewhere in the ship's deeper bones, engines growled, and the void shields flexed under distant fire. Apollos's voice sounded in the confined dark. "You have heard the name of the commander below?" "Vorgath Koul," Seth said. "A lord of Khorne. All the better. A beast calls to beasts." Seth turned his helm toward the chaplain. In the red launch light, his eye lenses were two hard embers. Do not start that sermon with me. I need not. You preach it every campaign. The torpedo launched. The world became acceleration and thunder. Metal screamed around them. Restraint clamps groaned. Somewhere beyond the hull, point defense fire clawed at their casing and failed. Then came the impact, so hard it threatened to crack teeth inside transhuman skulls. Breach charges fired. The nose of the torpedo blew inward through the enemy hull. Atmospheric pressure roared. Warning klaxons on the far side died in a burst of static. Seth tore himself free of the restraint bars and went through the wound first. The lower cargo deck of the slaughter barge was vast, dark, and wet. Not wet with coolant, not water, blood. It slicked the deck plating in a black-red sheen that reflected emergency lumens in long, trembling ribbons. Chain gantries hung from the ceiling carrying cargo hooks, cages, and butcher frames. Some were empty, some were not. Men and women in various stages of evisceration hung from them, their throats slit, their feet bound, blood still draining into troughs cut in the deck. The ship stank of opened bowels, overheated engines, wet iron, and the sweet rot of meat left too long in warmth. The first mortal crew came running, chain gangs and slaughter servitors with rotary saws and hooked poles, shrieking praises to Khorne as they charged the breach. Bolt shells tore them apart at once. Bodies exploded in wet bursts. Limbs spun away. Seth crossed the deck in great iron strides and cut through a saw-armed servitor so hard the blow split its torso, motor housing, and the human operator fused into its spine. Castor smashed aside a polearm thrust and drove his combat blade through a cultist's faceplate before blowing another apart with a point-blank bolt round. Then, the traitor Astartes arrived. They came down the length of the deck from blast doors marked with flayed skin and brass sigils, huge in crimson plate, chain axes snarling, trophy chains whipping against their armor. Bloodreapers, not the frothing rabble of broken warbands, but disciplined killers clad in ancient brutality, moving with the cold cohesion of long corruption. Their champion raised a barbed axe and roared a challenge. Seth hit him before the last word had left his vox grill. The impact sounded like a thunderbolt in a crypt. Seth's chains ward met the enemy axe, slid off the haft, and chewed into the traitor's gorget in a screaming fountain of sparks and blood. The champion reeled back, trying to wrench free. Seth headbutted him hard enough to crack the helm, then drove the revving blade upward under the jaw. The traitor's head came apart in a red-black spray that painted the bulkhead behind him. The rest of the deck dissolved into intimate slaughter. Flesh-tearers fought like caged murder, finally given room to move. Bolter fire lasted only seconds before the crush became too close for it. Then it was chain blades, combat knives, power swords, and gauntlets smashing through dented plate. Seth moved through it like controlled catastrophe. He cut off one traitor's arm at the elbow, stamped the warrior to his knees, and buried his blade through breastplate and spine. He ripped the weapon free while kicking the corpse into another enemy's swing, spoiling the blow. Castor tore a helm apart with his bare hand after his blade locked in rib armor. Brother Malak struck down a bloodreaper with a power axe blow that split collarbone to pelvis, only to take a chain blade across the thigh in return and keep fighting with blood spraying from severed cabling and flesh alike. This was not glorious war. There was nothing clean in it. Teeth of chain weapons clogged on meat and cracked bone. Blood sheeted across armor. Visors went red. One flesh-tearer slipped on the deck gore, went to one knee, and killed the traitor trying to capitalize on it by soaring upward through the foe's groin and belly until steaming organs fell out in ropes. The mortal crew fled where they could. The bloodreapers did not. Seth saw why the Imperium feared his chapter and did not care. Fear was useful. Fear kept distance between butcher and bystander. Fear reminded softer men that salvation often wore a face they would not want near them in peacetime. A roar rose over the deck, different from the rest. Brother Turn. Seth knew the voice instantly. Knew, too, the shift in it. Not battle fury, not even bloodlust. something older and far worse. Tern had a bloodreaper half lifted from the deck, both gauntlets locked around the traitor's throat, shaking him with impossible violence while he screamed words no son of Baal should ever speak lightly. "Horus," Tern was snarling. "Horus. Father. No. Father. I am coming. I am—" The black rage had him. It was always obscene in its suddenness. One heartbeat a warrior of the chapter. The next, a drowning man lost in 10,000 years of inherited death, hearing the last cries of Sanguinius as if they were his own. Apollos was already moving, Crozius rising, but Seth was closer. He crossed the deck in 3 strides, rammed his shoulder into Tern's side, and sent both Astartes crashing into a butcher trough. The traitor in Tern's grasp hit the deck hard and tried to rise. Seth stamped his head flat without even looking at him. Tern came up roaring, his helm lenses wild with wrong memory, blade clawing for Seth's throat. "Stand down," Seth said. The words meant nothing. Tern saw not his chapter master, but some phantom of betrayal at the Eternity Gate, or aboard the Vengeful Spirit, or in whatever fevered nightmare owned him now. He lunged. Seth met him with brutal familiarity. He knocked Tern's weapon arm aside, hammered a fist into the warrior's throat seal, then drove the pommel of his chainsword into the side of the helm. Once, twice, a third time, precise and merciless. Tern staggered. Apollos came in from the flank and smashed the Crozius into the back of the warrior's knees. Tern dropped, still snarling, still half in another age. "Bind him," Seth said. 2 battle brothers moved at once, mag clamps and chain restraints already in hand. There was no pity in their motions, no shock. This was the labor of the chapter as much as war itself. Apollos looked down at the thrashing warrior. He was close to the edge before deployment. "They all are," Seth said. For a moment he stared at Tern, at the lost fury shuddering through the brother's huge frame, and something hard passed behind his expression. Not sorrow, not quite. Recognition too bitter to name. "Put him in the cages," he said. "If he still has a mind when this ship is ours, he joins the Death Company. If not, then let his madness buy us one last kill before it takes him entire." He turned away before Apollos could answer. The bridge fell shortly after. Seth killed the master of the slaughter barge at his own command throne, pinning the traitor captain against a bank of blistering controls and sawing through helm, skull, and command spine until the body convulsed itself dead. He stood over the corpse while his brothers secured the bridge and the ship's surviving crew crawled whimpering from under consoles, only to die there. A ship serf in a blood-stiff void suit was dragged before him, the man so terrified he could barely force words through his broken teeth. "Message intercepts," the serf stammered. "My lord, incoming system command exchanges. Imperial, Astartes, the Space Wolves have made planetfall." At that, Seth gave the smallest imaginable snort. Of course they had. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf, High King of Fenris, a warrior with a legend broad enough to fill a feast hall, and twice as loud in the telling. Seth respected the name in the only way such things mattered. Grimnar was old, dangerous, and still alive, which made him worthy of notice. But Seth had no patience for Fenrisian grandeur or the kind of warrior kings who inspired men merely by entering a room. Inspiration was for worlds not yet ruined. Vulgaris needed killers. "Where is he?" Seth asked. "Inner Hive Command Lord. Carthax, Ground Council." Seth looked out through the bridge's cracked armored viewports toward the burning world below. Drop fires still scarred the atmosphere. He could imagine the wolves already among the trenches and hive ruins, snarling their war cants, breaking the enemy where they found it. Good for them. He keyed the command channel. "Take this hulk into a decaying orbit over Carthax. Strip its data cores. Arm the drives for terminal descent if I order it. Then ready a gunship." Castor's voice came back at once. "For the ground war?" "For the Council," Seth said. "I want to see how the wolf intends to kill this world while saving it." The bunker under Hive Carthax was too small for the men inside it, and too warm for clear thought. It smelled of old stone, vox ozone, incense, and men. One day, from death. Grimnar stood by the hololith with several of his wolf guard, broad silhouettes in battle-scarred plate, their pelts dark with soot and old blood. Around them clustered guard commanders, navy officers, and one or two mechanicus adepts, whose flesh looked secondary to the mechanisms preserving it. When Gabriel Seth entered, the chamber changed. Not because he announced himself. He did not. Not because his armor blazed brighter than Grimnar's. It did not. The change came because everyone in that bunker, even the men who had never seen a flesh-tearer before, felt the atmosphere draw tight around him. Grimnar was a storm at the door. Seth was the butcher already inside the room. One of the wolf guard took a half-step forward. Another watched Seth's hands. Grimnar turned. For a long moment, neither chapter master spoke. They measured one another in the old way, predator to predator, not for posturing, but for truth. Seth saw the age in Grimnar at once, not weakness, but the kind of hard-won authority that came only from surviving long enough to outlive entire generations of heroes. Grimnar saw, in return, what Seth had long stopped bothering to hide: exhaustion, wrath, and a violence held on a chain, one link from breaking. "The Great Wolf," Seth said at last. "The Lord of the Flesh-Tearers," Grimnar answered. No warmth lived in either title. Grimnar gestured once toward the hololith. "Your timing is useful." Seth glanced at the projection. Kill lines, hive sectors, enemy concentrations, deep underworks, artillery zones, sacrificial districts. "Your welcome is thin. You did not come for welcome." "No." That almost sounded like agreement. A guard general began to speak, perhaps hoping to smooth the iron edge between them. Grimnar silenced him with a glance, and Seth ignored him entirely. "The enemy's structure is broad," Grimnar said. "Koul is feeding the war through linked arteries. Slaughter, districts, ammunition corridors, command shrines, fuel pits, transit causeways. We break the outer spine first, isolate the ritual heart, and only then drive into the depths." Seth looked up from the projection. "While he keeps killing the world, while we stop him from killing it all at once. That is a bureaucrat's answer in a warrior's mouth." A murmur ran around the chamber. One of the wolf guard's lips peeled back from his fangs. Grimnar did not move. "And yours," the great wolf said, "is the answer of a blade that mistakes motion for victory." Seth stepped closer to the hololith, one gauntlet planting against its brass rim. "You know where the throat is. Koul. Cut the head off, and the rest spasms itself to death. If he were merely a warlord, yes. He bleeds. That is enough." Grimnar's eye hardened. "He is not standing at the head of a charge for your convenience. He is inside a machine of war built from districts and millions of corpses. If we strike too early, too narrowly, then every artery beneath him keeps pumping blood into whatever he is making. We break the structure. We isolate the heart. Then we kill him." Seth stared at the old Wolf King and saw not pomp, not some saga-drunk barbarian, but a commander who understood scale in a way most chapter masters never had to. That did not make him right. It only made the disagreement dangerous. Before Seth could answer, the surviving astropaths in the adjoining chamber began to scream. The sound knifed through stone and steel alike. Every head turned. An officer stumbled through the inner hatch, face white beneath soot. "My lords," he choked out, "the choir has a reading. Final coherence window. They demand command presence." They went at once. The astropathic chamber was dim and fever-hot. Incense hung in choking curtains. Blood striped the floor beneath restraint thrones. Half the choir were already dead in their harnesses, heads thrown back, eyes burned white, or burst from the sockets. Of those still living, none were whole in mind. One old choirmaster shivered against his bindings, lips split and black with dried blood, yet somehow he still forced words through a throat that sounded scraped raw by the warp itself. "Koul," he gasped. "Koul does not seek only victory of arms, he nears conjunction. The murders, the bloodworks, the hive depths, all aligned. The wound over Carthax is stabilizing." The chamber seemed to lean inward. "How long?" Grimnar asked. The astropath twitched so hard blood flecked from his mouth. "Hours," he whispered. Then, after a terrible pause, "Or days, no more. The gate will hold. It will hold and widen." Seth felt the whole war narrow in that instant. No more outer theaters. No more elegant reduction of enemy structure for its own sake. No more time. He turned his helm toward Grimnar. Now, at last, there was no room for disdain, no room for legend, no room for patience. Only war, and the knowledge that if they failed, Hive Carthax would not simply fall, it would open. The War Council beneath Hive Carthax had been assembled in a chamber meant for industrial oversight, not the governance of planetary extinction. Its vaulted ceiling had once borne the cog and hammer crest of some manufacturum guild. Now the heraldry was hidden beneath soot, impact scoring and strips of emergency cabling stapled across the stone like veins. The hololithic projector in the center of the room throbbed with a sickly blue light, spilling the image of Vulgaris over the faces gathered around it. Hive belts glowed red where they burned. Artillery lines flickered like open nerves. Icons of friendly formations shifted, vanished, reappeared farther back as units were overrun, rerouted, or annihilated. Around the projection stood the remnants of command, guard generals in carapace breastplates caked with trench filth, navy officers with smoke in their lungs and panic hidden behind discipline, confessors clutching relics slick with sweat, tech adepts whispering to data slates and optic arrays, Wolfguard broad as statues, and flesh-tearers standing like executioners, summoned to a legal proceeding they did not respect. All of them, in the end, were reduced by the presence of the two Astartes lords at the table. Logan Grimnar did not dominate the room by speaking the most. Gabriel Seth did not dominate it by threat alone. Yet between them, the chamber had become a place where lesser men felt the shape of their own mortality. Grimnar's silence was kingly in the old Fenrisian manner, heavy with judgment, the stillness of a predator upon a cliff above a killing ground. Seth's silence was different. It was the silence of a blade already wet and waiting to be used again. The officers around them felt both truths, and so they measured every word before letting it pass their lips. Grimnar stood with one gauntleted hand resting against the brass edge of the hololithic table. The shifting battle map painted cold light across the scars of his face and the pelts hanging from his armor. His single eye moved over the campaign with terrible speed. Sector by sector, he absorbed the shape of the war. Outer bastions, trench arteries, manufacturum zones, ammunition silos, slaughter districts, hive guns, air lanes, failing void shield nodes. No cogitator in the chamber could see the whole of it as cleanly as he did in moments. "The foe wants our gaze dragged to the center too soon," he said at last, and every voice in the room ceased. "Koul's heart is there, aye, but the blood feeding it runs through 100 arteries. You do not spear the beast in the chest while its limbs still pin you to the ground. You break the limbs, you sever the tendons, then you go for the throat." He pointed, and new root lines flashed into existence over the hololith. The ash wastes here and here, outer bastions along the northern curtain. "Those are mine." His hand moved with savage certainty, dragging projected markers into new positions. "My packs strike through the storm belts where their augers are half blind. We take the ridge batteries, blind their outer kill eyes, and start caving in their flank." He shifted to the west, where trench belts spread for hundreds of kilometers in layered, blood-churned webs. The trench labyrinth here is the artery feeding Carthax most directly. If it remains in enemy hands, the foe keeps its pressure on the hive wall and continues shoveling men and blood into the inner districts. Seth's gaze followed the indicated sector and did not waver. Grimnar looked up from the map. "That route is yours." Seth gave a short nod. "Good." One of the guard generals, a gaunt man missing half an ear and most of the skin on one cheek, swallowed before daring to speak. "My lords, with respect, if the trench labyrinth is the direct path to Koul, then should not both chapters combine their force there and drive inward at once? Decapitation may yet spare the hive." Seth turned his head toward the man with such blunt suddenness that the general actually flinched. "It may," Seth said, "or we bury both chapters in a kill tunnel and give Koul our gene seed to crown his altar." The general's throat worked. Grimnar spared him by speaking first. "The flesh-tearers will drive the central kill route because they are suited to it. Narrow front, intimate slaughter, no room for timid souls. My sons range wider. We hunt. We break the field so the center can be reached without throwing lives into a furnace." The distinction hung in the air like a drawn blade. A Space Wolf's wolf guard standing behind Grimnar gave a low, approving growl. "A clean hunt," he murmured to one of his pack brothers. "Break the beast's stride and let it turn to die." One of Seth's veterans heard it and said, in a voice flat as a coffin lid, "We do not care if it turns. We care if it stops breathing." That was the difference laid bare. The wolves spoke of hunt, of kill, of the tale carried after the battle was done. Even here, even in the pit of a dying world, there was a savage nobility to them, a belief that courage had shape and name and worth beyond utility. The flesh-tearers had no patience for such ornaments. They spoke of control, of pressure, of what needed to be butchered, and how fast, and with what cost. One chapter gave language to valor, the other gave language to necessity. Grimnar accepted the distinction without offense. He went on placing the war. "Guard armor forms the third thrust," he said. "Here, toward the hive guns, not because they will take them cleanly, but because they must pin every heavy asset Koul has overlooking the wall. If those guns continue firing uninterrupted, neither of our other thrusts matter." The armored commander of the Planetary Defense Reserve, a colonel with bloodshot eyes and tremor in one hand, bowed his head over the map. "My tank lines are broken, Lord. We can still muster columns, but not enough for a deep offensive. Most of our super heavies are wrecks or entombed in the mud." "Then you make the foe pay for every meter," Grimnar said. "You do not win the field. You hold his eye on you while better killers move where they must." The colonel inhaled, as if those words struck harder than any insult. Another voice broke in, strained and nearly raw. It came from a hive command official in guard uniform, whose insignia had been cut from finer cloth than most men in the room had ever worn. "My lord," he said to Grimnar, "before any offensive begins, we must have time for a full civilian evacuation from the lower habs and transit vaults. There are millions still trapped in the inner belts. If we open the roads and suspend bombardment for even a few hours—" "No," Grimnar said. The word was quiet. It still killed every other sound in the chamber. The official blinked. "My lord, if the roads are cleared, no. There are families still beneath the hive, workers, juveniles, wounded men in the underclinics. We cannot simply leave them to—" Grimnar turned to face him fully then, and the official fell silent, as if struck. "You open the roads now," the great wolf said, "and Koul turns them into slaughter lanes. He will shell the convoys from both sides, drive the refugees into each other, and choke the kill route with their dead. Or he will let them run and harvest them farther out in the ash where no wall shields them. Time does not exist for the mercy you ask. Not here. Not now." The man looked as though the words had torn something loose inside him. "That is murder," he said hoarsely. Grimnar's eye did not soften in the slightest. This whole world is murder. I am deciding which murders buy us another hour. The chamber remained silent for several heartbeats after that. Then a priest of the ecclesiarchy, unable or unwilling to bear the silence, raised his icon staff and began intoning a prayer for deliverance. His voice grew in fervor with every phrase, spilling over the table, asking the Emperor's wrath to fill the shells, the bolters, the hearts of his warriors. It might have gone on for some time had Seth not turned and walked directly to him. The priest faltered mid-verse as the flesh-tearer's lord stopped a handspan from his face. "How many ammunition crates have you carried today?" Seth asked. The priest stared, uncomprehending. "Lord, I minister to the souls of the faithful. How many?" "I am ordained to—" Seth took the icon staff from his hands and thrust it into the chest of a shell-shocked munitions runner standing nearby. Then he pointed toward the rear hatch, where labor crews were dragging fresh bolt shells and anti-armor canisters into the bunker. "You want to serve the Emperor," Seth said, each word clipped and brutal. "Then move ammunition. The dead do not need your voice. The living need rounds." The priest's mouth opened and shut soundlessly. "Go," Seth said. The priest went. No one in the chamber moved to defend him. The last argument died there. Plans became orders. Orders became signal bursts and coded vox chains. Outside the bunker and across the vast black wounds of Vulgaris, the campaign convulsed into motion. The offensive began beneath a sky already split by fire. In the ash wastes north of Carthax, the space wolves came on through storms of cinder and chemical sleet, their transports and land raiders throwing rooster tails of grey-black dust behind them, while gunships carved low through the murk overhead. Packs spread and converged with lupine instinct, moving across the wastes by instinct and augur alike, bypassing minefields by scent, memory, and savage pattern reading, where lesser commanders would have blundered into prepared death. Fenrisian war cants rolled across vox channels in deep, exultant growls. They hit the outer bastions before the defenders believed any force could cross that ground so quickly. Bastion walls cratered inward under melter blasts. Frost blades rose and fell in the smoke. Grey hunters stormed embrasures and dragged traitor artillery crews from their guns to die in the mud below. Long fangs shattered enemy armor at ranges so extreme the shells seemed to come from the wrath of the sky itself. Thunderwolf riders hit one breached redoubt like a spear thrown by an angry god, their mounts bounding over razor wire and wreckage to tear into panicking thrall ranks with fang and claw, while the riders hacked apart the armored overseers trying to rally them. Further west, Seth led the flesh-tearers into the trench labyrinth. There was no grandeur in that sector, no wide maneuver, no room for saga. The trench lines were a world of claustrophobic murder, communication saps twisting. Between redoubts and shell craters, duckboards floating on blood-black water, bunker mouths vomiting gunfire into fog made of smoke and atomized flesh. The flesh-tearers descended into it without a word. When they emerged again, it was at the head of slaughter. They fought trench by trench, bay by bay, bunker by bunker, their assault a chain of close-range massacres linked together by momentum and fury. Bolters flashed in the narrow dark. Chainswords screamed against flesh, flak, rusted steel, and traitor ceramite. Grenades turned dugouts into ovens. Seth moved always at the point of greatest resistance, not because command required it, but because the violence did. Wherever the enemy braced hardest, he went there and broke it with his own hands. His warriors followed in utter, merciless discipline, every brother holding his chain tight, every outburst of rage directed forward, never sideways, never wasted. In the center and south, the guard armored thrust began its grinding crawl toward the hive guns. Columns miles long rolled through shell-churned plains under cover of smoke screens and desperate air support. Lehman Russ companies advanced through ground, so broken their tracks vanished almost to the hull line in mud made from men. Chimera carriers burned in rows. Super heavy tanks, whose names had once rung proudly through parade grounds, now lumbered forward blackened and half-repaired, firing as they went, their hulls so pitted by fragments that they looked gnawed by iron wolves. Above them, macro shells from the hive guns and counter-battery emplacements fell like meteors, each impact birthing towers of earth, armor plates and human bodies that rose and came back down in burning pieces. From orbit, the fronts of the offensive were visible as new scars opened across the face of the world. Trench networks glowed red and white from constant fire. Tank columns moved like iron centipedes through the blasted approaches. Manufacturum loaders, once used to stack ore and engine casings, now trundled on tireless tracks between rear positions, carrying mountains of dead toward pyres, render vats and burial trenches too shallow for the numbers they held. Billions remained trapped in the hive levels above and below, listening to the whole planet grind and howl around them. Millions were under arms. Millions more were already dead. Whole continents burned without pause. For hours the offensive seemed, impossibly, to work. The wolves tore 3 outer bastions open and silenced a battery line that had hammered Carthax for weeks. They held those gains with laughter in their throats and fresh blood on their blades. Their vox channels carried boasts, kill counts, and rough praise for the worthy dead, even as they prepared to strike again. The flesh-tearers carved an arterial corridor through the trench labyrinth, taking bunker clusters, command pits, and siege depots in a sequence so fast the enemy's reserve flows stumbled and choked. Seth's warriors left the trenches behind them looking like abattoirs after a riot. Walls painted red, duckboards floating under severed limbs and shell casings, smoke hanging low over rows of bodies opened so violently that trench water ran pink for kilometers. The guard armor, by blind courage and attrition beyond reason, reached firing distance of the outer hive guns and began dueling them through curtains of exploding mud and steam. Men died by the thousands to buy those firing lines. They held them anyway. Then the first reports came in from the adepts studying the enemy signal pattern. A tech priest, half his face replaced by brass augmetics vibrating with data stress, keyed into command channels with a voice gone metallic and shrill. "Correlation anomaly," he intoned. "Enemy ritual flux increasing in ratio to total battlefield bloodshed. Repeat, ritual flux increasing in ratio to total battlefield bloodshed." Grimnar heard it from a captured bastion command pulpit, overlooking the ash wastes. Seth heard it from the mouth of a trench bunker, still dripping with blood. At first the message seemed absurd, one more scrap of Mechanicus jargon, trying to clothe terror in formula. Then more data came. Heat blooms in the underhive, pressure spikes beneath Carthax, warp luminance rising above the central hive at the exact pace of the day's casualty counts. Every gain, every breach, every slaughter, feeding it. Not merely loyalist deaths, not merely civilian harvests, all of it. Koul had built a war that drank every drop spilled upon the world. By the time dusk should have come, though no true dusk could be seen through Vulgaris's permanent haze, the truth had become impossible to deny. The enemy was not resisting the offensive in spite of its blood cost. It was using that cost. It was shaping the battle so that every desperate push, every close-range kill, every artillery barrage, and every mounded trench of corpses pumped more sacrifice into the hidden engine beneath Hive Carthax. Koul wanted them to fight. Worse than that, he wanted them to fight exactly this way. By the second day of the offensive, victory had learned how to mimic an ambush. The Imperial advance did not slow because the enemy had grown stronger in any visible way. It slowed because whole sectors ahead simply emptied themselves. Trenches that should have been death-choked and fiercely held were abandoned to the last sandbag. Bastions whose guns had hammered the line for weeks now sat silent, embrasures black, banners hanging limp in the hot poison wind. Hab districts that should have boiled with crossfire lay open and still, their streets carpeted in ash and paper, and the scorched remains of household gods toppled from alcoves. The silence was wrong. Every warrior on Vulgaris knew it. Mortal and transhuman alike felt it in the tightening of the spine, in the itching of old scars, in the way breathing itself seemed an intrusion upon the hush. The first flesh-tearers to enter the vacated trench arteries discovered the price of that silence when Brother Helen stepped over what appeared to be a corpse and vanished in a flower of red mist and sharpened bone. The dead had been mined, not merely with charges buried under cadavers. The bloodreapers had gone further, as they always did. They had packed bodies with grenades and demolition charges, stitched trigger wire through rib cages and jaw hinges, and buried pressure plates beneath piles of torn limbs so that the battlefield itself became an abattoir trap. In some sectors, chain snares had been stretched knee-high in the murk, hidden under sludge and spent shell casings. The first warrior to trigger one found himself jerked sideways into a wall of rotary blades rigged behind a collapsed dugout mouth. In others, trenches narrowed deliberately into kill corridors, where traversing bolter nests and buried melter mines turned every meter into a butcher's scale. It did not stop the flesh-tearers. It only made them angrier. Gabriel Seth led from the very front because he trusted no one else to stand where the pressure was greatest without either slowing or losing themselves to it. He moved down the trench line with the certainty of a guillotine drop, every step taken through smoke, blood spray and trench water made pink by the opened dead. The trench clearing became less an advance than a rolling dismemberment. Dugout by dugout, bunker by bunker, the flesh-tearers tore through the enemy with such relentless violence that the line ahead of them seemed to collapse not tactically, but spiritually, as if courage itself had been bludgeoned from the defenders. Seth was almost too successful. Castor knew it before anyone said the words aloud. The veteran sergeant of the flesh-tearers moved 3 paces behind his chapter master through the collapsed artery line designated Red 9, and every sense he possessed told him the slaughter was beginning to turn. There was a difference between righteous violence and indulgence, a difference between fury used and fury enjoyed. The former kept a warrior alive. The latter opened a door in the blood. For 6 hours they had fought without meaningful pause, 6 hours in choking trenches, where each turn brought another knot of chain-axe-wielding traitors, another bunker vomiting fire, another nest of mortal scum too stupid or too damned to run. Castor's armor was lacquered red from collar to greave. Blood had soaked his joints and dried in black scales. The rebreather filters in his helm clicked and labored with every inhalation. Everywhere he looked, he saw brothers panting through grill speakers, shoulders rising and falling too fast, blows lingering a little longer than needed, chain blades sawing a fraction too deep into corpses already dead. Brother Malak laughed when he killed now. Only once. Only briefly. But Castor heard it. Brother Routh had stopped answering squad-level Vox acknowledgements in words, responding instead with harsh snarls and breath. Brother Enkiel had carved the Aquila from a bunker wall with the edge of his combat knife, then hacked through the icon again and again until Seth ordered him onward. Even Apollos, black-armored and skull-faced among them like judgment given form, was fighting with a speed that bordered on hunger. Castor hated that he understood it. Hated even more that part of him wanted to surrender to it. The trench stank of opened bowels, hot iron, promethium, and that copper-rich perfume of freshly spilled blood that crawled into the back of the throat and stayed there. He was drenched in it. His muscles burned with its promise. Hours of butchery had reduced the world to impacts, targets, arterial sprays, kill confirmations, the wet give of flesh under powered teeth. It would have been so easy to let the old curse step closer, to stop maintaining distance from himself. He voxed privately to Apollos as Seth stormed another traverse and tore the head from a blood reaper with 3 roaring passes of his chain blade. "They are fraying." The chaplain's reply came at once, dry as tomb dust. I know. We need a halt. A halt kills momentum. So does the black rage in the middle of a trench crush. Ahead of them, Seth did not slow. He vaulted the body of a dead traitor and drove into the next pocket of resistance before the last body had finished twitching. Apollos answered after a moment. Then we keep the chain tighter. That was the work. Always. Not merely slaying the enemy, but measuring every brother against the abyss while drenched in blood enough to drown reason. Castor killed a lobotomized thrall with a bolt through the eye socket and stepped over it into the next communication cut. A trip chain brushed his greave. He saw it too late to avoid, but he was already shouting a warning when the charges buried in the trench wall blew outward. Mud, bone splinters, and corpse meat filled the air. He hit the opposite revetment hard enough to crack ferrocrete. His helm went white with static. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard one of his brothers roaring, another screaming prayers, another laughing in that same wrong, low rhythm. Castor forced himself upright and found two traitor berserkers already charging through the blast smoke, chain axes lifted. He met them with knife and bolter, shooting the first in the face at arm's length and ramming his blade up under the second warrior's chin. Teeth screamed, blood sprayed across his visor. He tore the blade free and saw Seth still advancing, still killing, still dragging the whole line with him like a wound being ripped open wider. It was working. That was the danger. Far to the north, among the ruined Hab sectors outside the broken outer bastions, Logan Grimnar hunted a different way. The district had once housed manufactorum overseers and senior guild cadres, which meant its towers were taller, its Hab blocks broader, its streets more regular than the worker warrens farther down hive. Now every avenue was split by shell holes, and every upper level was either burned out or collapsed. The district smelled of dust, hot plasteel, ionized air, spilled promethium and fear, old enough to sour into something almost sweet. It should have been impossible to track command elements through such a ruin by anything except Vox intercepts and auger returns. Grimnar ignored both when he chose to. He crouched in the rubble of a shattered avenue while grey hunters fanned around him through the smoke. His head turned slowly, the old warrior reading the dead city by signs no machine would ever catalogue properly. The pattern of shell impacts, the directions in which civilians had run before they died, the concentration of brass iconography left not for worship, but for orientation, the places where corpses had been moved after death, leaving darker stains under them and drag marks through the ash. Above all, scent. Not mortal scent alone, though that was there in abundance. The thicker tang of Astartes plate opened recently for repair, the machine oil used by bloodreaper serfs in their armor rites, the kill breath of fear coming from men ordered to stand somewhere they did not want to die. He lifted one gauntlet and pointed toward a half-collapsed transit arch. "They have command farther in," he said. A wolf guard to his right glanced at the Auspex plate mounted on his wrist. "No signal return there, Lord." Grimnar bared his teeth. "Then they know enough to hide from your toys." He rose and moved. His pack followed without question. That was the difference between experience and data. Data told a man what was present. Experience told him what should be present and was missing. The bloodreapers had left this district too open, too clean in places, not abandoned, prepared. The first proof came when a Hab block facade blew outward in a storm of brickcrete and rusted rebar, disgorging berserker reserves hidden within the hollow shell. They came on roaring, red-armored and frothing, a wave of chain axes and brass iconography, their mortal auxiliaries racing between them with hooked poles and demolition satchels. The space wolves met them laughing, bolters cracked, frost blades flashed blue in the smoke. A pack leader hurled himself from a shattered stairwell to come down on a traitor champion hard enough to break both warriors through the floor beneath them. Grimnar hit the center of the enemy rush with old, magnificent violence, not frenzy, but command sharpened into murder. His axe took a berserker's arm and head in the same sweep. A backhand blow caved another traitor's breastplate and pulped the hearts within. Around him, the wolves howled their kill cants, not to lose themselves, but to bind themselves tighter as a pack. Then the district showed its true obscenity. They came stumbling from a side alley in a ragged knot of perhaps 24 small bodies, bareheaded, ash-smeared, some barefoot, some in torn worker tunics, all of them no older than the underhive should ever have demanded of them. Their skulls had been shaved and branded. Their eyes were open but empty. Bomb harnesses had been riveted into their chests and backs, wires run under the skin, trigger studs nailed through collarbones into meat. Servo motors clicked in their spines as they lurched forward. Child levies, lobotomized, rigged to burst. Even the wolves hesitated for half a heartbeat, and that was enough for one of the little figures to reach the corpse of a fallen traitor and begin keening in a thin mechanical register. Grimnar saw the detonator rune glowing under its ribs. "Kill them," he ordered. A pack warrior spat a curse. "Lord, kill them now." Bolter fire tore through the children. The explosions were smaller than proper demolition charges, but no less horrible for that. Bodies burst in wet blossoms of red and black, shattering nearby masonry and showering the wolves in gobbets of blood, teeth, and bone. More came from windows and cellars. More had to be cut down before they reached Imperial positions farther back. A grey hunter lowered his weapon by a fraction, staring at what remained of one small corpse twitching in the street. "This place is rotten to the roots," he snarled.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Grimnar's eye never left the streets ahead. Advance. They did, because stopping was how the enemy won. By the time the wolves and flesh-tearers collided in the collapsing Hab sector designated Theta Val, the district was already coming apart around them. Seth had punched through the trench labyrinth faster than expected and emerged into the lower Hab belts with his leading companies blood-drunk and half-shrouded by smoke. Grimnar's packs had shattered the outer command nodes and driven inward from the north. The two advances met amid a maze of stacked Hab towers, burning service bridges, and streets so clogged with rubble and bodies that tanks could not pass. The moment should have been one of ceremony. It became a slaughter instead. Bloodreapers hidden in the Hab shafts triggered chain snares and deadfall charges, dropping whole walkways onto the converging Astartes columns, while berserker reserves surged from maintenance ducts and shrine vaults. Wolves and flesh-tearers found themselves back-to-back among falling ferrocrete and screaming civilians who had been used as living barricade stock. Their methods clashed at once. The wolves flowed by pack instinct, spreading laterally, taking upper levels, calling target marks in fierce, clipped bursts. The flesh-tearers drove straight and hard through the densest knots of resistance, using shock and intimate brutality to crack the enemy's spine before it could flex. Different methods, same result. A pack of grey hunters took a gantry line above the avenue and raked traitor mortals from the rooftops, while Seth and his veterans cut through the central street below in a wet corridor of severed limbs and opened throats. A wolf guard smashed aside a berserker's chain axe and hurled the corpse into a bunker mouth just as Apollos caved in the bunker's blast shutters with his Crozius, trapping the enemies inside to burn. One flesh-tearer sergeant and one Space Wolves pack leader found themselves fighting shoulder to shoulder at the mouth of a chapel reliquary filled with brass-masked cultists. They never exchanged names. They never needed to. When the chamber was cleared, each gave the other a single nod and went on killing elsewhere. For a few minutes, in that shattered artery of the city, the two chapters fought as if some older and cleaner age of the Imperium still existed. Then the enemy twisted the knife again. More child levies came. This time they flooded from lower Hab basements and transit shafts in numbers so large the avenue seemed alive with them. Some were already dead and driven forward by crude shock prods fixed into their spines. Others whimpered as they ran. One boy, perhaps 7 standard years by the look of him, still had enough mind left to sob for his mother, even as the explosives wired under his chest bones blinked green. Seth saw a flesh-tearer hesitate, only for a heartbeat, only long enough for one of the children to reach the warrior's greave and detonate. The blast took the brother at the knee and sent him crashing sideways into a fallen Hab shrine. Before he could rise, another knot of bomb-rigged little bodies stumbled toward him over the rubble. "Burn the district," Grimnar said. A Space Wolves Vox operator looked up sharply. "Lord, Promethium, heavy, every lower ingress, every Hab stack between our lines and the wall. Burn it all. There are survivors still inside," a guard liaison shouted over the Vox static. Grimnar's answer was glacial. "And if we pause to pull them free, this whole thrust dies, and the Yay world dies after it. Burn it." The order went out. Promethium tanks ruptured under deliberate fire. Heavy flamers and incendiary shells turned the lower Hab levels into linked furnaces. Fire climbed through ventilation shafts and burst from windows in sheets. The cries that followed were human for only the first few seconds. Then they became one vast animal screaming under the roar of the flames. Seth watched the fire take the district and said nothing. He had no judgment to spare for Grimnar's call. He understood it too well. A moment later, Brother Routh of the Flesh-Tearers finally crossed the line he had been walking all day. Castor saw it happen at the edge of the burning avenue. Routh stood amid 3 traitor corpses and 1 dead child levy, chest heaving, chainsword hanging low. Then he threw back his head and screamed, not in triumph, not in battle cant, but in pure transfigured madness. "Horus!" he howled. "Face me!" He turned not toward the enemy, but toward the nearest movement, which was Brother Enkiel, dragging a wounded wolf clear of a collapsing wall. Seth was there before anyone else. He did not shout, did not plead, did not invoke brotherhood or memory or service. He struck. The first blow sheared Routh's weapon arm off at the elbow. The second drove through the chest seam and out the backplate. The third, delivered as the maddened warrior tried still to reach him with the remaining hand, took the head off at the gorget. Routh's body crashed to the street and twitched among the rest of the dead. Seth ripped his chain blade free, turned, and kept advancing without a word. That was command among the flesh-tearers. Not mercy, not spectacle, necessity. By the time the fires had consumed Thetaval and the converged Astartes forces had driven through the district, the shape of Koul's design finally showed itself in full. It came not from one source, but from many. Captured data cores, Mechanicus survey returns, astropathic fragments screamed from dying choirs, maps overlaid upon maps until the dead world beneath them became a monstrous equation. The slaughter districts were not isolated. The trench labyrinth was not merely a military artery. The abandoned bastions, the mined corpse fields, the sacrificial hab blocks, the raised convoy routes, the blood cisterns beneath the manufactorums, all of it formed a geometry of offerings stretching across continents. Vulgaris itself had been turned into an altar so large that no one who had looked only at a single front could have understood it. Hive Carthax was not the ritual. Hive Carthax was only the final altar stone. In the command bunker, amid the stink of smoke and burned flesh still clinging to everyone who entered, the tech adepts placed the final projection over the hololith. Lines of arterial red ran beneath the hive like veins. All of them descended. All of them fed one buried locust directly under the capital's root levels. Apollos stared at it, through the red glow of his helm lenses. Grimnar stood with arms folded, expression carved from winter iron. Seth did not blink at all. The adept who voiced the conclusion sounded as though he wished the words would kill him before he finished them. "The ritual core," he said. "A central mechanism, perhaps demonic, perhaps industrial, likely both. The bloodworks converge there. Unless that locus is destroyed, the accumulation will continue regardless of surface reverses." "Name it," Seth said. The adept swallowed. Intercepted liturgies referred to it as the gore crucible. Silence followed. Then Grimnar asked the only question left that mattered. How do we stop it? The answer came quickly, because there was no comforting lie left to tell. Someone must descend through the hive underlevels, the adept whispered, reach the crucible, and destroy it at the source. Only then did the room understand the true shape of the war to come. They had been fighting for the surface of a world. Now they would have to descend into its throat. The descent began where the hive forgot it had ever belonged to men. Below the hab belts and transit arteries of Carthax, below the manufactorum galleries and the sealed municipal vaults where clerks had once filed production tithe ledgers by the billion, the underhive opened like a throat cut all the way to the spine. Lift shafts plunged into blackness so deep, even Astartes' autosenses needed heartbeats to adjust. Access tunnels gave way to slag catacombs carved through old industrial strata, chambers vast enough to swallow cathedrals, galleries lined with rusted pipework, thick as void ship trunks, all of it sweating heat and blood and chemical runoff into rivers that moved sluggishly through grates and channels toward the unseen heart below. The world changed down there. Surface war had thunder and sky and room to maneuver. The underhive had none of those mercies. It had walls. It had corners. It had echoes that made a bolter shot sound like the beginning of a cave-in, and the scream of a dying man sound as if it came from every direction at once. Logan Grimnar and Gabriel Seth divided the assault, not because they trusted one another, but because the battlefield demanded it, and both men were too experienced to let pride argue with necessity. "The upper kill routes are mine," Grimnar said over the command vox before the descent began. "Every reinforcement Koul means to funnel down into your throat. I will break above you." Seth stood at the mouth of a freight shaft lined with warning sigils painted in dried blood. Around him, his warriors checked magazines, blessed chainsword teeth with thumb smears of fresh gore, and fixed mag lamps over shoulder plates, even though most would fight by autosense and muzzle flash alone. "I do not need your protection," Seth replied. "No," Grimnar said. "You need the path kept open behind you. There is a difference." Seth gave no answer for a moment. Then, "Break it cleanly, Wolf." A low growl of something almost like amusement came back over the link. "Go kill your monster, Lord of Cretaceous." Seth cut the channel and descended. The flesh-tearers moved into the dark, the way executioners walked toward the scaffold, without hesitation and without ceremony. Elevators no longer functioned in the lower hive, their machine spirits dead, corrupted or screaming nonsense in Binharic static, so the descent became a sequence of grav ladders, maintenance shafts, slag ramps, and broken ore conveyors, slick with black water and corpse grease. Every level deeper stripped away another layer of the world men had built. The walls sweated heat from buried reactors. The air grew heavy with rendered fat, furnace ash, old blood, and the sweet throat-fouling reek of meat being reduced into something useful for engines. The first corpse-rendering plant they found had once been an industrial recycler for failed vat stock and protein waste. Koul's butchers had merely enlarged its purpose. Conveyor hooks ran overhead in endless linked chains, carrying flayed cadavers toward rotary grinders and pressure furnaces, where the dead were crushed, boiled, and separated into oils, fats, and carbon feed. Thousands of bodies hung there, turning slowly in the heat, many human, many abhuman, some still in torn uniforms of Vulgaris line regiments, some no more than naked skinless torsos with numbered iron tags hammered through collarbones. The machines still worked, not because they had operators. Their operators were dead in heaps around the control shrines, sacrificed in place when the last orders were given. The machines worked because blood fed them, and because whatever lurked in the wiring now had learned to enjoy its labor. Seth walked through the plant with bolt pistol in one hand and chainsword in the other. When the first bloodreaper thralls burst from behind the suspended dead, He shot them at arm's length and kept moving. The flesh-tearers followed in murderous silence. Bolt pistols cracked like execution shots in the dark. Chainswords screamed and chewed through flesh, bone, and flak cloth. Arterial spray sheeted across the chains, across gauntlets, across the riveted walls themselves, until the underworks seemed painted from within by a living thing's opened veins. Tunnel fighting belonged to them in a way surface war never entirely could. There was no distance to tempt reflection, no grand field to blur kills into abstractions. Here every death came hand close and undeniable. Here a battle brother felt the blow travel through the weapon into his wrists. Here the enemy died against his armor and slid down it. Brother Enkiel took a bunker throat by blasting the hatch seal apart, driving his shoulder through the molten breach and emptying his pistol into the first 3 defenders before the smoke cleared. Castor went right of him, chainsword revving, gutting a kneeling traitor through the lower spine and ripping the blade free in a wash of steaming gore. Apollos came through last, black-armored and implacable, Crozius rising and falling in controlled arcs that broke skulls and powered helms alike with the same grim indifference. "Maintain the line," the chaplain voxed. "Do not race the blood." Seth heard it and said nothing. Apollos' warning was for the others. Seth was already what he was. Above them, Grimnar's war unfolded with a different brutality. The upper underhive arteries were not the cramped butchery pits the flesh-tearers descended through, but broader utility routes and industrial galleries where reinforcement streams could be rerouted, trapped, and cut apart. The space wolves fought there like executioners in smoke, packs converging and splitting with instinctive discipline, driving wedges into every column Koul tried to send downward. Where the enemy pushed hard, the wolves hit from 2 angles and tore the head from the rush before it could gather force. Where the traitors tried to hide command cadres among masses of mortal thralls, Grimnar scented them out through fear, machine oil, and the tiny pattern errors men made when trying to look unimportant under pressure. He vox-linked once as Seth's companies dropped through a broken slag chute into the furnace galleries below. 3 reserve flows severed, Grimnar reported. In the background, Seth could hear bolter detonations, the howl of wolves, and the raw, wet sounds of men dying. Koul is feeding what he can through deeper utility cuts now. He knows where you're headed. Good, Seth said, stepping over a heap of headless labor serfs, chained wrist to wrist. Let him stop pretending this war is subtle. Grimnar's answer was immediate. Do not mistake a cornered beast for a simple one. Seth killed the link before it could become conversation. The deeper they drove, the worse the resistance became. Koul's chosen bodyguard waited where the underworks narrowed into the final descent bands. They were not thrown forward in wasteful countercharges. They had been placed, anchors in the dark, meat on the hook. The first of them emerged through steam from an opened pressure hatch, towering above even traitor Astartes in Baroque plate layered thick with chainmail, skull racks, and brass icons. Their armor was old, older than the war around Vulgaris, older perhaps than the world's current tithe records, each suit a relic of long corruption, swollen by additional plating and ritual growth. They fought with chain glaives, thunder hammers studded with teeth, and slab shields made from cut reactor plating. Around them lumbered mutant ogres bound in iron harnesses, their shoulders riveted into dragging chain yokes, their muscles inflated by chem abuse and warp contamination until they resembled flayed engines more than living creatures. Electroprods burned along their spines. Hooks pierced their cheeks. Some had second jaws stapled into the flesh of their bellies, so they bit and screamed even as the upper mouths were shot away. The descent became a meat grinder. In the choke point called Furnace Gate, a tunnel mouth no wider than 2 cargo haulers abreast, Seth's lead company hit the bodyguard head-on. Bolt shells sparked and burst against ancient shields. Melter guns took one mutant ogre full in the chest, and only managed to turn the front half of it into hissing ruin, while the rear half still stumbled 3 more strides on spinal reflex before collapsing. Chain-bound brutes crashed into the flesh-tearer's line with enough force to split ceramite and shatter bones beneath. Traitor veterans behind them fought with disciplined hatred, each blow measured to crowd the loyalists tighter into the killing corridor. Seth went at the largest of them, a veteran in horned cataphractii plate, carrying a chain glaive whose head glowed red from continuous use. Their weapons met in a crash that shook sparks across the tunnel roof. The traitor was powerful. Seth was angrier. He rode the second swing inside the glaive's arc, let the hooked chain teeth scream across his pauldron, and buried his pistol muzzle under the enemy's jaw. The shot blew the back of the helm off in a geyser of bone, black blood, and brass fragments. Seth ripped the chainsword through the veteran's chest seam before the corpse could fall and hit the next foe without missing a step. Caster was at Seth's right, as he had been in 100 such presses before. He kept the wedge coherent. He killed fast, efficiently, never wasting a motion, never letting the company's fury outrun its shape. Seth trusted that more than he trusted almost anything. That was why Caster's death mattered. It came when one of the chain-bound ogres crashed through the corpse pile at the tunnel flank and brought a length of broken conveyor axle around in both hands like a maul. Caster saw the strike turning toward Seth. He moved before thought, shoving his chapter master aside with one shoulder and taking the blow full across chest and helm. The impact broke him. Ceramite burst inward. His torso folded around the axle in a spray of internal blood and shattered armor seals. The ogre bellowed, lifting Caster half clear of the ground on the embedded bar. For one grotesque heartbeat, the sergeant still lived, one hand clawing for his chain blade, trying to continue the fight with both hearts already failing. Seth killed the ogre with 12 roaring, teeth-rattling strokes that carved one arm off, opened the belly, and finally took the head entirely. The corpse fell backward, dragging the axle and Caster's ruined body down with it. Everything around Seth narrowed. Apollos voxed a command for cohesion. Enkiel shouted for the flank to close. The tunnel still thundered with gunfire and screams. None of it mattered for that single instant. Seth went to one knee beside Caster. The sergeant's helm had been crushed in at the brow. Blood and broken optics leaked from the grill. One eye still functioned, dim and red through the crack. "My lord," Caster rasped. Seth put one gauntlet on the warrior's shoulder. The gesture was brief and hard. "You held." Caster tried to laugh and managed only blood. "Try not to waste it." Then he died. Structurally, it tore more than one warrior from the line. Caster had been Seth's weight on the right hand of every push, a veteran whose voice kept battle brothers anchored when the blood rose too high. Emotionally, it drove a nail into the whole company. The grief did not soften them. It tightened rage until every movement after that seemed one link closer to a snapped chain. "Forward," Seth said, rising. There was no eulogy. Not there. Not then. Above them, Grimnar heard the clipped notice of Caster's death over the shared tactical net and was silent for a moment before speaking. "You lost a good one." Seth hacked his way through another knot of traitor thralls while replying, "Spare me the mourning rites." "I was not offering rites." Bolt of fire barked across Grimnar's end of the link, followed by the snarling cheer of wolves as some enemy countercharge broke. "Only truth." Seth rammed his chain blade up through a berserker's ribcage and kicked the corpse free. "Then speak more useful truth." A pause. Then, "Koul has chained the hive reactors into the right." That got Seth's full attention. "Say it again." Mechanicus adepts found the feeds in the upper control shrines. Whole reactor stacks slaved into the bloodworks. Coolant flow, turbine pressure, plasma venting. If the right peaks before the chains are severed, killing Koul may not be enough. The world could still break open around his corpse. Seth felt the underhive around him differently then. The heat in the walls, the rumble underfoot. The pressure pulses through the pipe arteries, not merely industry. A loaded weapon aimed upward through the whole body of Carthax. "So the beast has its hand on the trigger," he said. "Aye. And if I cut off the hand without disarming the weapon, you damn the world anyway." For the first time since their alliance began, Seth answered Grimnar without contempt. "Then keep the streams broken, wolf. I will tear the weapon out by its roots." Grimnar's reply came low and certain. "I know you will." Respect between such men did not sound warm. It sounded like that. The last descent shaft opened beyond Furnace Gate, dropping into a cavernous artery of old reactor support works and chapel engine spaces that no sane hive planner would have admitted existed. Blood ran openly here now, not in pipes alone, but in channels cut through the deck, through gutters lined with brass teeth, down steps worn slick by centuries of industrial runoff and now fed by fresher harvest. Overhead, chains descended from darkness carrying corpses that turned slowly in the heat like obscene censers in a cathedral. The air itself seemed to chant, not voices exactly, engines, pumps, turbines turning under impossible load, their rhythms altered until the whole chamber muttered in metallic liturgy. Seth and his surviving company advanced through rank heat and low red mist toward a set of colossal gates worked from layered iron jaws. The gates stood open. Beyond them waited the outer chamber of the gore crucible. It was not merely industrial. That would have been easier to understand. It was a chapel built by a factory, having nightmares of hell. Iron teeth lined the arches. Hanging corpses formed draped aisles between piston columns. Rivers of blood ran in intersecting channels toward a central abyss lit from below by furnace light and warp glare. Cathedral-sized engines crouched along the walls, their pistons pumping, their pressure stacks vomiting incense, ash and atomized gore into the high dark. Brass bells tolled with no visible hands upon their ropes. Great chain racks held flayed bodies stretched into symbols, visible only from above. On the far side of the chamber, framed by bloodfall, engine light, and the suspended dead, stood a figure in ancient crimson plate. Koul. He had not been dragged here by alarm. He had not arrived in haste. He stood at ease beside the ritual machinery, as though presiding over a throne room prepared for a guest he had expected to the minute. Across the vast chamber, his helm turned towards Seth. Then Koul opened his arms in welcome. Koul's counterstroke began with silence on the upper roots. The firing lines north of Hive Carthax had been roaring without pause for 2 days, their thunder so constant that men forgot silence had once belonged to the world. Then, in the blackened hours between one bombardment cycle and the next, the enemy guns along the western Manufacturum Ridge simply stopped. No probing fire, no ranging shells, no berserker rushes stumbling blind through smoke. The skin flags above the trench mouths hung still. Even the Vox traffic from captured enemy channels thinned into little more than static and the wet mutter of machine corruption. Logan Grimnar stood atop the blasted parapet of a half-shattered bastion and watched the silence spread. Below him, the upper hive war still burned. Tank duels rolled across the ash wastes beyond the ridgelines. Air support screamed over broken hab blocks and bastion walls. The dead lay everywhere, thick enough along some trench lips that they formed their own revetments. Yet inside that ruin, Logan sensed a vacuum opening, a deliberate emptiness where pressure should have been greatest. He keyed the command vox. All packs hold their current push. No advance without my word. A wolf guard beside him glanced up from a blood-smeared tactical slate. "We have them bending, Lord. Another hour and the western line cracks." Logan's eye remained on the dead city and the smoke belts beyond it. "That is why they have ceased howling." The answer came a moment later, not from the west, but from everywhere else at once. Auger stations lit up. Vox channels drowned in warning bursts. From the ruined highway arteries north and east of Carthax came mass movement on a scale that made the earlier fighting look like a border raid. Hidden reserve columns burst from ash bunkers, underbridge depots, and manufactorum loading caverns. Corrupted armor regiments ground forward under black exhaust plumes, whole squadrons of battle tanks and siege engines painted with butcher sigils, their hulls draped in chains and strips of human skin. Macro cannon emplacements that had seemed silenced for good swung up from concealed pits and void shield trenches. Behind them came the hordes, tens of thousands of blood-mad human thralls, charging beneath skin flags and brass icons, their shrieking voices carried ahead of them like a weather front. And among those ranks strode the demon engines. Some were brass-plated quadrupeds with furnace maws and piston limbs, built in mockery of hounds and battle tanks alike. Others crawled on segmented iron torsos, dragging cannon clusters and chain tentacles through the rubble. One vast engine, taller than a hab block's lower stories, strode on reverse-jointed legs beneath a shrine howl of vox speakers, its chest cavity split open to reveal a bound thing of flame and teeth writhing inside. Koul had not abandoned the upper roots. He had emptied them so he could flood them all at once. "He means to pin us," one of the wolf guard growled over the rising alarms. "Keep us from the underhive." Logan gave a single curt nod. Aye. He saw the shape of it now with predatory clarity. The sudden lull on the western line had been bait. A commander less experienced, or more eager to taste a clean breakthrough, would have committed his reserves deeper there and been trapped in open pursuit, while the true counter-offensive closed around the upper hive arcs. Koul was not merely throwing bodies to delay the wolves. He was trying to encircle them in broken districts, hold them in place with brute scale, and seal Gabriel Seth beneath the world just as the gore crucible reached its height. Logan's orders snapped across the Voxnet at once. Ragnar Pack redeploys to the north breach. Long Fangs shift fire lanes to the eastward armor. Gunner, collapse your pursuit and wheel south. Leave the dead where they lie. Harrick, I want the ridge guns speaking now, or I will use your skull for a range marker. Confirmation growls and battle oaths answered him. The Space Wolves moved with brutal speed, their packs breaking from successful assaults and wheeling into new kill positions before the enemy's counterstroke fully closed. There was no hesitation among them, only the rough-edged obedience of warriors who knew their lord saw the whole hunt when they saw only the next throat to cut. That was Logan at his greatest. Not merely a giant with an axe, not merely the old king of a savage people, but a battlefield sovereign who could watch a world-sized slaughter and decide, in breaths, which places must be held, which abandoned, which fed with lives, so that the war itself could continue living long enough to be won. He chose where men would die. That was command. Everything else was costume. The first collision hit the northern bastion chain like a tectonic event. Corrupted armor regiments opened the attack, battle cannons and siege mortars hammering the ridgeworks until stone, ferrocrete, and flesh leapt skyward in sheets. Under that storm came the human hordes, blood-crazed and screaming, thousands upon thousands of them climbing over their own dead, while skin flags cracked above their heads. Behind them bounded demon engines, iron beasts whose every footfall shook dust from the bastion walls. The Space Wolves met them in disciplined fury. Grey Hunters held the line until the last useful second, then countercharged through breaches choked with smoke and debris, their howls rising over the guns. Long Fangs cut fire corridors through enemy armor with practiced savagery, missiles and Lascanon beams walking across hulls until tanks burst open like furnaces kicked apart. Blood Claws, half feral in their joy but never truly uncontrolled, leapt into the churn where the thrall hordes pressed thickest and butchered with chainblade and pistol at arm's length, while older pack brothers anchored their flanks and dragged them back from overextension. Loyal defenders trapped in collapsed redoubts found wolves smashing through to them out of the smoke, hauling the living clear, thrusting them toward rearward fallback trenches, and then going right back into the advance without a pause for gratitude or ceremony. There was heroism in it, yes, but never sentiment. No one stopped to cradle the wounded and whisper hope beneath. The shelling. The wolves saved whom they could while still killing, still moving, still pressing the hunt. A life preserved was only meaningful if the line did not die around it a moment later. In the district of Gath and Spire, Logan led the countercharge himself against the towering demon engine whose Shrine-Vox throat had been bellowing blasphemies across the battlefield. The monster strode through the Hab ruins beneath an arch of smoke and sparks, chain limbs ripping chunks from structures as it advanced, its chest furnace blazing with caged warp light. Autocannon bursts from its flanks pulped men in red vapor. One of its legs crushed a Chimera transport flat, with the crew still screaming inside. "Mine," Logan said. He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. His wolf guard followed him in close formation through the shattered avenue as enemy fire lashed around them. The demon engine turned its weapon clusters toward the approaching wolves and opened fire, shells, hammering the street into fountains of fractured stone. Logan went through it with his shield up and his axe low, moving with old, impossible speed for something that large. A wolf guard to his left took a direct hit and vanished in a burst of blood and ceramite shards. Logan did not slow. He hit the demon engine at the knee joint. The first blow bit deep enough to spill molten ichor and shrieking sparks. The machine staggered, its chain tentacles whipped down, one clipping Logan's pauldron hard enough to rip free chunks of pelt and plating. He rode the impact, stepped inside the reach of the iron lash, and struck again at the same point. This time, the joint ruptured. The engine collapsed sideways with a metallic scream that shook broken glass from every ruin around them. Before it could recover, Logan climbed it. He mounted the thrashing thing like a hunter, climbing onto the back of a dying sea beast, and drove forward along its burning spine, while his guard kept the lesser. Limbs off him with axe and frostblade. The furnace cavity in the engine's chest split wider, the bound warp thing inside roaring with newborn hate. Logan reached the front of the machine, planted one armored boot against its iron ribwork, and rammed his axe down into the caged demon heart with both hands. The engine detonated in a gout of fire and screaming brass fragments. When the smoke cleared, Logan was still standing atop the burning carcass. Word of that kill raced through the loyalist channels faster than any formal signal. Men in trenches and shattered habs saw the towering shape of the great wolf amid the flames and believed, for a few precious moments, that old saga mattered enough to push back hell. It was not entirely a lie. Below, in the underhive, matters worsened by the minute. Seth's force had driven to the threshold of the gore crucible, but Koul's trap was still unfolding around them. Massive blast doors began dropping through the tunnel systems above, and behind the flesh-tearers, each slab of iron thick enough to seal transit arteries built for ore trains. Some crashed down under enemy demolition charges. Others were triggered by corrupted control shrines deeper in the works. Whole sections of tunnel went dark as power was cut, then flooded with boiling coolant runoff, diverted from chained reactor manifolds. Slag channels burst their banks. Service corridors drowned in blood-thinned chemical wash, hot enough to strip skin from mortal bone and scar even ceramite. The flesh-tearers found themselves isolated one choke point at a time. Seth heard the reports as bursts of static and clipped kill-vox from squad leaders fighting their own little wars in the dark. Rear access sealed. Third support file lost in coolant surge. Enemy boarding from maintenance shafts. Numbers rising. Blast door impact. No retreat path. He kept moving anyway, carving through Koul's chosen, while the outer chamber of the crucible shook with the labor of the engines and the chanting pressure of the right. Somewhere behind him, Apollos was dragging the company into a tighter defensive ring. Somewhere farther back, Wounded brothers were either being hauled forward or left where they fell, because there was no room for anything in between. Above, Logan heard enough of it to understand the danger. He stood over the tactical hololith in a command vault, half buried under shell impacts, while every front of the upper hive war screamed for attention. The western outer assault was finally beginning to crack the enemy's flank. Another hour there, and the wolves might roll the whole sector back, opening breathing room for guard armor and silencing 2 macro cannon pits that had butchered loyal positions for days. To abandon that attack now would be to waste every life already spent taking the ridge. A rune flashed over the underhive overlays. Seth's route was narrowing, sealing, drowning. A guard marshal, face grey, with strain and old blood, pointed toward the western assault markers. "My lord, we have them there. If we commit the reserves now, we can shatter the line." Logan stared at the rune cluster that represented Seth's dwindling corridor. "And if we do?" he asked. The marshal swallowed. "Then the upper hive encirclement breaks." "And below?" No answer came, because everyone in the room understood. Seth was not merely another allied commander trapped in a bad position. He was the only blade already buried close enough to reach Koul in time. If that blade was left in the dark to be broken by collapsing tunnels and flooded choke points, the wider victory on the upper routes would become ash in the mouth. Logan made his choice. "Break off the western assault," he said. The marshal recoiled as if struck. "My lord, there are thousands already committed. If we pull them now..." "They die," Logan said. "Aye." The word hung in the room like a hanged man. Another officer found the courage to protest. "We can still win that front. We are not fighting for that front anymore." "My lord..." Logan's eye cut to him, and the protest died unborn. "All reserves redeploy to the underhive breaches. Demolition teams, breacher tanks, melter crews. Gunners' packs hold the retreat corridor long enough for whoever can run to run. Whoever cannot, dies buying time. The western assault is over." There it was, hard and grim. No drama, no attempt to soften the truth. Thousands of loyal men, perhaps tens of thousands, were being abandoned in a successful advance because somewhere deeper under the capital, a more important war had to be opened. Logan did not make the decision out of camaraderie for Seth. He did not suddenly discover affection for the Lord of the Flesh-Tearers. He made it because he knew a weapon that lethal could not be squandered. "Get me to the seals," he said. The redeployment was savage. Space. Wolves' packs peeled off active engagements and sprinted through smoke-shrouded utility districts toward the marked descent routes. Breacher vehicles rammed through rubble and hab walls to reach old service shafts. Melter teams burned at blast door hinges until metal ran white. Loyal troops still fighting in the west screamed over the Vox for reinforcement and received only terse orders to hold until death or withdrawal, whichever came first. Some cursed the wolves, some blessed them, most simply died where they were told. Logan went with the first breach force into the lower access spine called Fenris Arch. Enemy resistance there was fanatical and immediate. Koul had anticipated an attempt to reopen the descent and packed the approach with traitor Astartes, heavy servitors, and more of the chain-bound mutant ogres that had bloodied Seth's advance. The tunnel mouth became a furnace of detonations and hand-to-hand slaughter. Wolves and traitors smashed together in air thick with burning propellant and atomized blood, every blow close enough to smell. Logan was magnificent in it, not because he shouted the loudest, not because some aura of mythical heroism surrounded him. He was magnificent because, even in a tunnel jammed with corpses and fire, he still fought as commander and executioner at once, killing what had to die while keeping the whole assault coherent around him. He broke one traitor veteran's shield wall with a shoulder charge that sent 3 armored bodies down into the corpse pile, then turned and barked 2 clipped orders that shifted his packs into a wedge before the enemy realized the line had buckled. A mutant ogre lunged through the steam, and Logan simply split its face to the spine, stepped over the collapsing body, and drove his warriors on. Melter blasts turned one sealed blast door into a dripping wound. Demolition charges took the second. The third had locked halfway down and jammed on the bodies beneath it, leaving only a gap, little higher than a man's shoulder. Wolves crawled through it under incoming fire and expanded the foothold with chain blade and bolt pistol. As they drove deeper, the vox became clearer again. Faint at first, buried under static, heat distortion, and the metallic mutter of the hive's chained engines. Then stronger. Grimnar keyed the shared channel. Seth? Nothing. He fought through another knot of bloodreapers and tried again. Seth? This time a burst of laughter answered him. Not joy, not relief. Something harder and closer to madness, but still controlled by sheer force of will. When Gabriel Seth's voice finally came through, it was thick with blood, vox static and raw fury. "Wolf!" he snarled, and laughed again, the sound sharp as a butcher's hook on bone. "Koul is close." The ritual heart beneath Hive Carthax had the scale of a lie told by madmen and believed by engineers. It was too vast to have been hidden under the capital for any sane. Age of the Imperium, too old in some places, and too freshly butchered in others. The chamber stretched away beneath the hive root in terraces of iron, slag, and shrinestone, descending toward a central abyss over which hung a wound in reality itself. Magma glowed through cracked vents and furnace throats in the walls, washing the cavern in a red-orange pulse that never held steady for more than a few breaths. Blood fell from overhead channels in cataracts, pouring from the upper works in sheets thick as drapery and splashing into cistern trenches carved with brass runes. Chains descended from darkness in impossible numbers, carrying cadavers, bell clappers, iron censers, and flayed skin banners that turned slowly in the furnace gusts. Beneath the warp wound, a mountain had been built from skulls, broken armor, engine housings, and sacrificial iron, all fused together by blackened blood and heat until it formed a throne mound, or altar, or siege redoubt, depending on where one stood to. Look at it. And still, for all the infernal spectacle, the chamber remained a battlefield. The logic of murder had not been replaced by nightmare. It had been perfected by it. Gun lines had been cut into the terraces. Kill lanes crossed the lower approaches in disciplined, overlapping arcs. Ammunition cranes still crawled along rail tracks, carrying shell drums and promethium cells between firing pits. Vox relays blared half-corrupted range data through brass speaker towers, their machine spirits screaming over the liturgical chanting of the engines. Demolition charges had been set at the mouths of the access tunnels, their timing circuits tied into control shrines, manned by butcher priests and bound servitors. Every stair, gantry, and bridge had been chosen for field of fire. Every corpse mound doubled as cover. Every river of blood concealed grates, sumps, or buried mines. Koul had not built a temple and forgotten war. He had built a fortress that prayed in slaughter. Gabriel Seth saw all of it in the first moments after breaching the outer chamber, and answered with violence. The flesh tearers hit the lower terraces in a wedge of bolt fire and chainsword smoke. Breach charges blew out one bunker mouth. Bolt pistols cracked through the red haze. Flesh and armor burst in the close dark. Seth drove straight into the first gun line before the defenders finished traversing their weapons. His chainsword ate through the collar and upper chest of a traitor gunner, showering the recoil pit in red foam. He shot a second bloodreaper in the throat and stamped the dying warrior backward over the ammunition feed. Behind him, Enkiel and the surviving veterans of Caster's company spread left and right through the lower works, kicking over shell racks, slashing coolant lines, planting melter charges on the support braces beneath enemy firing nests. Apollos came in the center, like a funeral toll made flesh, Crozius smashing helms, ribs and weapon housings with the same grim certitude. The flesh tearers needed no speeches here. The place itself had done the work. Every brother who entered the crucible saw at once what Koul had made from the bodies of Vulgaris, and felt whatever was left in him harden into something too narrow for pity and too furious for fear. Then Logan Grimnar came through the reopened tunnel arteries above. He did not descend in radiant heroism. No beams of sanctified light followed him. No choir marked his arrival. The space wolves entered the chamber as a colder kind of storm, emerging from smoke, burst hatches, and slag-dark side routes, with disciplined fury already set to purpose. Grey hunters seized upper firing galleries before the bloodreapers realized the reinforcement streams had truly been broken. Long Fangs established murderously efficient fire points on broken gantries and slag conveyors, their heavy weapons barking through the infernal red murk to rake the central terraces and cut apart enemy reserve movements. Wolf. Guard hit the flank bunkers in paired strikes, one pack pinning, the other climbing through maintenance shafts to slaughter the crews from behind. The two chapters met in the same battle, but not in the same manner. The flesh-tearers went through the lowest throat of the chamber, up to the knees in blood channels and corpse piles, taking the direct path through intimate butchery. The wolves spread wider above, smashing apart the shape of Koul's defense with pack coordination and predatory battlefield sense. One force was a spear thrust for the heart. The other was the hand breaking the ribs around it. The bloodreapers held with terrifying professionalism. They did not collapse into hysterical worship because demons stirred overhead. They did not run because two chapters of loyalist Astartes had reached the crucible. They fought as Koul had taught them to fight, every retreat measured, every countercharge timed to the chamber's logic. Chosen bodyguards in ancient plate anchored the terraces with shields and chain glaives, while mortal thralls died in rows to buy them seconds. Chain-bound mutant ogres, grotesque with iron and chem-bulged flesh, lurched from iron cages beneath the bloodfalls and threw themselves into the lower approaches, breaking apart masonry and men alike. Heavy weapon nests shifted targets with veteran discipline, pouring shells into choke points already cluttered by the dead. Above all of it, the warp wound trembled and widened. At first, it had only bled light into the chamber, a bruise of red-black radiance hanging over the skull mountain. Now its edges pulsed as though breathing. The air around it quivered. Frost grew across hot iron. Then, with a sound like silk tearing over a grave pit, the first lesser demons came through. They spilled from the wound in handfuls and shrieking knots, clawed things of red hide and brass teeth that hit the terraces running. Some were little more than flensing beasts with blades for hands and fury for brains. Others came in leaner shapes, horned and laughing, carrying axes that dripped smoke instead of blood. They landed among bloodreapers, flesh-tearers and wolves alike, attacking whatever moved with equal delight. The battle became three-sided in a heartbeat. Gun lines swiveled, Vox channels filled with overlapping kill reports, demands for ammunition, warnings about breaches opening where no wall had stood a moment before. Demons bounded through shell craters and over corpse piles into traitor firing pits, dragging screaming gunners from their weapons, even as flesh-tearers stormed the same positions from the front. Wolves on the upper galleries cut down warp spawn with bolter bursts, and then turned those same guns on advancing berserkers before the spent casings had finished bouncing. On the lower levels, Seth's company fought through a press, where traitor veterans and lesser demons hacked at one another in the same breath they hacked at loyalists. Seth saw Koul through it all. The Chaos Lord stood beyond the mountain of skulls, framed by bloodfalls and engine light, a warlord in ancient plate presiding over the ruin, as though every death still obeyed his hand. Chain sigils descended behind him from the ceiling vaults into the ritual machinery beneath the altar mound. Each pulsed with dark red luminance, the final seals of whatever damnation the gore crucible had not yet completed. Seth began killing straight toward him. He did not order a measured advance. He did not pause to observe wider geometry. He knew the wolves would handle that, or die trying. What lay before him was the throat. He drove into it with both hands closed around murder. A chosen bodyguard lunged from the blood mist with a chain glaive held two-handed. Seth shot him through one lens, took the sweeping counterstroke across his shoulder guard in a scream of sparks, and ripped his chainsword through the veteran's abdomen hard enough to spill steaming entrails over the deck. A demon pounced onto his back from some unseen ledge, shrieking into his vox grill. He seized it by the skull, tore it free, and smashed it into an ammunition rail until its spine burst out through its own chest. Another bodyguard came from the left, behind a slab shield of reactor plating. Seth met the shield with his own shoulder, drove the traitor sideways into a blood channel, and hacked through shield rim, forearm and neck before the warrior could recover balance. He was too deep. Apollos knew it first. So did Enkiel. So did every veteran trying to keep pace with their chapter master as he opened the chamber before him in arterial ruin. Seth had nearly reached the lower rise of the skull mound when Koul's elite chose their moment. They came from both flanks and from beneath. Hidden lift grates blew out under the blood channels. Buried hatchways crashed upward under explosive bolts. Koul's remaining chosen surged out in a ring of ancient ceramite and crackling chain blades with hulking ogres behind them to seal retreat. The whole trap closed in at arm's length. Seth killed the first two who reached him, gutted the third, then vanished under a knot of red and brass plate as chain glaives, hooked axes, and armored bodies crushed together around him. The grinder became intimate and obscene. A shield edge smashed into Seth's helm hard enough to whiten his vision. A chain blade tore across his thigh plating and bit flesh beneath. He rammed his pistol under a traitor's gorget and blew the warrior's throat backward through a collar of brass. Another hit him from behind. A third locked his weapon arm. He headbutted one until teeth and black blood sprayed from the helm grill, only for an ogre's hooked chain to wrap his waist and yank him down onto one knee in the blood-slick dark. Koul watched. That, more than anything, sharpened the fury in Seth beyond language. The Chaos Lord did not intervene. He let the trap work. Let his chosen chew at the flesh-tearer's master like dogs worrying a chained beast. Across the chamber, Logan saw the lower knot close and understood at once what it meant. He did not bark some noble cry and charge blindly down the terraces. He reasserted shape first. That was why he was who he was. Long fangs, blind the central pit, he voxed. Missiles on the gun nests, 2 volleys, then shift left. Harrick, cut that gantry and deny them the upper lane. Wolfguard with me. Grey hunters hold the demons off the lower throat until your magazines run dry, then do it with blades. His orders crashed across the chamber and the battle bent to them. A gantry, overloaded by crack detonations, broke and fell into one of the enemy reinforcement routes, crushing traitors and demons under its burning mass. Missile fire ripped through a central bunker line and turned a carefully prepared kill corridor into a storm of shards and smoke. Grey hunters pushed into a demon rush, not because it was glorious, but because if they did not, the warp things would flood the lower approach and seal Seth's fate, whether or not the chosen finished him first. Then Grimnar descended. He came through the smoke and lower fire, not as rescuer in light, but as an avalanche of cold violence. Wolfguard struck with him in a brutal wedge, storm shields battering aside the outer ring of Koul's chosen, while frost blades and axes did what they had been forged to do. Grimnar himself smashed the first traitor bodyguard so hard the warrior's spine blew out through his backplate. He turned inside a glaive thrust and took the arm off its wielder at the elbow, then buried the returning cut through helm and clavicle. An ogre swung a chain hook big as an anchor claw. Grimnar stepped under it, planted his boots in the blood-slick deck, and split the mutant from jaw to sternum. The knot around Seth broke. Not cleanly, not all at once, but enough. Seth came up from a knee in a wash of black blood and enemy. Viscera, half dragged, half risen, chain blades still roaring. Grimnar killed the Chosen trying to come over Seth's shoulder, and then turned his head just enough to meet the other chapter master's gaze for a heartbeat through smoke and furnace glare. No gratitude passed between them, no warmth, only recognition. "Mine is the path," Seth growled. Grimnar answered by chopping down a demon clawing toward both of them and saying, "Then walk it." That was all. It was enough. The flesh-tearers struck forward again. The wolves locked the flanks. Together they drove toward the altar rise, while the chamber collapsed deeper into demonic panic around them. Bloodreapers died in their own gun pits. Lesser demons bounded through the furnace mist and were smashed apart by bolter fire or cut down in clouds of greasy smoke and burning ichor. Overhead, the warp wound swelled larger, its edges now alive with clawed silhouettes, trying to force themselves through into a world not yet fully open to them. Koul stepped at last from stillness into action. He mounted the skull rise with the majesty of something that had mistaken massacre for kingship so long that the two had become inseparable in him. His armor dripped blood from old channels worked into the plate itself. The chains descending behind him rattled and strained as the crucible's engines howled louder. He looked first at Seth, then at Grimnar, and when he spoke, his voice rolled through the chamber from a dozen vox towers and shrine speakers at once. "Look at yourselves." The words were not shouted, they were carried. The battle did not stop, but men and monsters alike seemed to hear them. "The carrion wolf and the chained beast," Koul said. "One dresses slaughter in command, the other calls it necessity. Both of you are ancient violence pretending at virtue." Seth's jaw clenched. He knew too well why the words struck, because some part of them cut close to the wound. Koul turned, his helm fully toward him. "You came here because your sons must kill, or they will feed on those they are sworn to defend. You know what you are, son of Baal. The only difference between your hunger and mine is the prayer muttered over the blade before it falls." Seth took one step forward through the blood and smoke, and Enkiel knew at once how close the words had come to reaching too deep. Then Koul looked to Grimnar. "And you, old king, you kill with cleaner hands and think mastery makes you different. It does not. You choose which men die and call it wisdom. You burn children in their homes and call it war. Your savagery only wears a crown." That struck Logan differently, not because it accused him of blood, but because it mistook his command for mere appetite. The great wolf's eye hardened to something colder than rage. "I do not mistake myself for tame," Logan said. Koul spread his arms. "Then admit it. Strip away the heraldry, the sagas, the oaths, the painted myths of brotherhood and duty. This galaxy belongs to killers. It always has. I merely kneel to the truth without draping it in the corpse cloth of honor." No one answered him with philosophy. Seth shot first. The bolt shell exploded against Koul's pauldron and staggered him half a step. Grimnar moved at the same instant, ordering concentrated fire onto the chain seals behind the warlord. Wolves and flesh-tearers alike opened up where they could, bolt rounds, melter lances and crack bursts slamming into the altar rise. Too late. Koul seized the nearest of the final chain seals in both gauntlets and tore it free. The first ripped loose with a shriek like a city dying. Warp light burst down the links in a red-black surge. He tore the second out by main force, ripping iron, brass and consecrated steel as though they were wire. The third burst apart under his heel. The remaining chains snapped one after another as the engines of the crucible reached a pitch that made teeth, ache and blood vibrate in the veins. The warp wound above the skull mountain widened. Power fell into Koul. Not apotheosis, not yet, but far more than any ordinary Chaos Lord should have borne and remained in one shape. His armor swelled as if something underneath it had inhaled. Horns of black iron and coagulated bone crawled longer from his helm. Cracks of furnace light opened along his breastplate and gauntlets, leaking red radiance like wounds in reality itself. His voice deepened into layered thunder as the blood running around the altar began to whirl toward him in tightening circles. Across the chamber, every warrior who saw it understood the same truth in the same instant. They had run out of time. If Koul was not killed now, before the power settled fully into him, before the wound above grew wide enough to birth something greater through his flesh, then the gore crucible would make of him a thing neither chapter, nor perhaps the whole burning world above them, could any longer stop. Koul came down from the altar like a falling fortress. The blood whirl around him became a storm of red-black spray and furnace sparks, flinging strips of flensed skin, broken icons, and clots of steaming gore across the terraces as he descended. Whatever the crucible had poured into him had not made him graceful. It had made him vast. His armor bulged and cracked with inner radiance. Veins of hellish light pulsed through every plate seam. His horns had grown long and hooked, one curling back over the crown of his helm, the other thrusting forward like a spear of blackened bone. The axe in his fist looked small until he swung it. The first wolf guard to meet him died so violently that the body ceased to resemble a man. Koul's axe came down in a vertical arc that split shield, arm, chest, and deck plating alike. The blow bit so deep into the iron floor that magma light flashed up from the sundered seam beneath. Before the corpse had even fallen clear, Koul backhanded a second warrior across the chamber, hard enough to cave his breastplate inward and send him tumbling through a bank of shell cranes in a shriek of twisted metal. A flesh-tearer lunged at the warlord's flank with chainsword revving. Koul caught the descending blade in his free gauntlet, crushed the weapon housing until it burst in the loyalist's hands, and drove the horn of his helm through the Astarte's face with such force that the back of the helm exploded outward in a fan of blood and broken ceramite. Stone shattered where he trod. Armor broke under him like kiln-dried bone. This was no mad berserker lost in the joy of slaughter. This was a warlord who had spent centuries killing beings exactly like those who came for him now. Every movement knew where ceramite split. Every feint knew how Astartes guarded themselves. Every killing stroke landed where superhuman anatomy became a weakness rather than a gift. Koul's power had grown monstrous, but the intelligence guiding it remained cold, lucid, and hateful. Seth went straight into it. He did not circle. He did not test. He did not waste a breath on challenge or vow. He hit the Chaos Lord chest close, exactly where the worst of the danger lay, because that was what he was made for. Koul's first turning blow took a chunk from Seth's pauldron and sent pain cracking down his whole left side. Seth answered by driving his chainsword into the opening under Koul's right arm, not deep enough to cripple, only enough to draw the first hot gush of black-red blood and prove the bastard could still bleed. Koul laughed. The sound was not human. It was a furnace throat opening wider. He slammed the pommel of his axe into Seth's faceplate, denting the helm and filling the world with a flash of white static. Seth staggered and came back forward anyway, shooting point blank into Koul's chest seam while hacking for the neck with the chain blade in the same motion. 2 rounds detonated across the warlord's breastplate, gouging radiance-lit cracks through the crimson armor. The chain blade struck a rising vambrace, screamed, skipped, and bit into the upper shoulder. Koul twisted inside the blow and drove one horned knee into Seth's ribs, hard enough to fracture plating and flesh beneath. Seth heard something break in him. He did not step back. That refusal became the shape of the duel's first phase. Seth took the most savage part of the fight because he would accept no other part. He crowded Koul with relentless, intimate violence, never letting the warlord set the full arc of his monstrous strength if sheer rage and proximity could deny it. Every time Koul tried to widen the distance and turn a killing sweep into room-clearing murder, Seth was there in the pocket, chainsword chewing sparks from the haft of the axe, bolt pistol barking into gorget seams, shoulder and knee and elbow driving like pile drivers. He drew blood again and again. He took worse in return. Koul split the lower rim of Seth's breastplate, and opened a long, ruinous wound from hip to midriff. Seth answered by sawing through one of the chain trophies hanging from Koul's waist and plunging the revving teeth into the exposed joint behind the armor tassets. Koul rammed a gauntlet into Seth's throat and hurled him backward over a mound of skulls. Seth rolled through it, came up on one knee, spitting blood into his helm grill, and launched himself back in before the next heartbeat had properly formed. Logan Grimnar fought the same battle by another law entirely. Where Seth was pressure, Logan was timing. Where Seth accepted pain as the price of closeness, Logan measured angles and breath and footing with the absolute dominance of age honed into instinct. He did not hurl himself at Koul in constant collision. He watched the pattern under the fury, read the tiny fractions of commitment in every swing, and struck only when the blow would buy shape for the whole fight instead of merely adding another wound. He hit from the flanks and vanished from the line of the axe before its backswing could take him. He carved at tendons hidden behind swelling armor. He battered aside bodyguard remnants trying to reseal the duel into a private killing pit. He barked kill orders over the Vox without ever once sounding hurried. Left terrace holds, no retreat. Long fangs, lower the breach point by 3 meters and rake the demons through the smoke. Apollos, your right is sagging. Fix it, or I will. Even in the middle of nightmare, he was still reasserting battlefield mastery around himself, forcing chaos back into lanes a commander could use. The chamber beyond the duel had become a butchered apocalypse. Wolves and flesh-tearers held the demonic spillover at catastrophic cost. Grey hunters fought back-to-back in shell craters full of blood and brass shell casings, cutting lesser demons apart only for more to bound over the smoking corpses. Flesh. Tearers stood in trench-like corpse channels at the chamber's lower edge, bolt pistols flashing in the dark, while chain blades tore through red flesh that smoked instead of bled. Long fangs on the broken gantries continued firing until demons clawed up the support braces and had to be beaten off with empty missile tubes and combat knives. Apollos and Enkiel fought like reapers trapped in the final hour of a world, one laying about him with Crozius and pistol, the other dragging wounded brothers back from the bloodfalls, only to throw himself straight back into the next rush. The dead stacked into berms and breastworks of their own. Shattered plate, broken horns, severed limbs, and burning shrine icons formed drifts around the lower terraces. Ammunition ran low. Vox channels choked in static and overlapping kill reports. Breach charges planted earlier went off at imperfect intervals as wounded serfs died on their triggers or blood-drowned timing circuits. Furnace gusts blew smoke, sideways, then upward, then back down again in oily sheets. The chamber's logic was starting to collapse under the mass of the violence, and still the battle worsened. Koul nearly won when he saw what Seth truly was, and chose to tempt it loose. The Chaos Lord gave ground by inches, letting Seth think pressure had forced him backward toward the base of the skull mound. He took wounds for it, real wounds, shoulder opened, thigh joint leaking black-red slurry, one horn half shorn away by Grimnar's axe. Yet all the while he spoke, vox booming between blows, each word aimed like a knife into the old floor. "Yes," Koul growled as Seth drove his chainsword teeth across the warlord's cracked breastplate. "That is the truth of you." He smashed Seth across the helm, and the flesh-tearer staggered into a rain of bones. "Closer!" Koul's axe bit the deck where Seth's head had been and sent molten sparks up around them. Angrier. He slammed a gauntlet into Seth's broken ribs and felt something cave. "Let it off the chain." Seth roared and came in harder. Too hard. That was the brink. Logan saw it instantly. Seth's footwork ceased to exist as calculation and became pure collision. His strikes gained brutality and lost patience. His guard opened between blows. He stopped fighting Koul and began trying to obliterate him through velocity alone. Another breath of that, and the Black Rage, or something close enough to damn the difference, would have taken the chapter master in the center of the crucible itself. Koul saw it too. That had been the point. He widened his stance, drew the axe back for one colossal killing arc, and let Seth hurl himself straight into the trap. Logan intervened on the half-breath. He did not shout warning. He did not call Seth's name. He moved. The great wolf stepped in from Koul's weapon side, not to stop the blow entirely, because nothing short of a titan's brace could have done that, but to ruin its perfection. His axe struck Koul's haft just above the lower grip with all the force of veteran timing and unspent fury. The monstrous swing changed angle by the width of a hand. That width saved Seth's life. Koul's blow still hit. It tore across Seth's upper back instead of taking him through the neck and chest. Ceramite burst. Flesh opened to the spine. Seth crashed forward onto one hand and one knee in a wash of blood so heavy even the deck channels seemed to darken around him. Before Koul could follow the injury with the execution, Logan was already there again, low and cold and merciless. His next strike landed at the back of Koul's damaged knee joint. The joint burst. The warlord dropped half a step and roared, not in triumph now, but in real pain. Seth looked up through cracked helm lenses and understood exactly what had happened. Their eyes met for a heartbeat through furnace light and blood mist. No gratitude, no speech. Seth spat a gob of blood onto the deck and rose. From there, the annihilation began in earnest. They dismantled Koul piece by piece, because that was the only way anything like him ever truly died. Not with one noble stroke, not with duelist's elegance, with converging wrath and relentless reduction. Logan took the weapon first. He harried Koul's axe arm every time the great weapon rose, carving deeper into the shoulder seam, forcing the warlord to compensate with brute power instead of balanced leverage. Seth took the pane openings, battering in chest close, locking the haft with his own blade, hacking at the fingers gripping it, driving bolt rounds into the glowing cracks under the breastplate. Koul broke Enkiel in half when the flesh-tearer veteran tried to join the circle, and the sight only made the loyalists tighten further. A wolf guard died dragging one of the last bodyguards off Logan's flank. Apollos held a knot of demons at the lower stair with one functioning arm, and a Crozius head cracked almost through. The wolves on the upper gantries were down to pistols and blades. The flesh-tearers at the blood channels fought in absolute silence now, too deep into expenditure for war cries, killing by instinct and oath alone. Koul's axe finally failed under the converged punishment. Logan battered the haft at the same moment Seth jammed his chainsword into the widened crack near the grip. Frost-forged metal, demon-fed brass and old corruption all gave way at once with a shriek like a tortured engine. The head of the axe spun away, trailing sparks and warp fire. The broken haft remained in Koul's fist for one useless instant before Seth tore it free and drove the jagged remnant through the warlord's side. Koul answered by seizing Seth at the throat one-handed and lifting him clear of the deck. The flesh-tearer's boots kicked through smoke and ash. Blood poured from the ruin in his back and the split under his ribs. Koul squeezed, armor and flesh shrieking together, and dragged Seth closer until their helms were almost touching. "This," Koul snarled, warp light leaking from his cracked grill, "is what you are." Seth rammed the teeth of his chainsword through Koul's wrist from below and held the trigger down. The hand came apart in sprays of black-red blood and sheared bone. Seth dropped, half fell, half tore free, and Logan was there to drive his own blade into the opened shoulder socket left above the ruined arm. Koul reeled. Seth hacked across the warlord's abdomen. Logan cut low again. Seth rose with a roaring upward slash that split breastplate from belly to sternum. Koul staggered back into the lowest chain seal of the altar mound. That was when Logan changed the kill from duel to execution. "The seal," he voxed. He did not need to say more. Seth understood. They hit both at once. Logan buried his axe into the chain anchor, driven through the ritual iron behind Koul, shearing brass housings and rune-inscribed bolts. Seth, rammed his chainsword into the open chest wound, and drove the warlord bodily backward against the same failing anchor. The chain seals snapped under the combined impact. Everything above them screamed. The warp wound lurched wider, then spasmed. Power surged through Koul again, but this time without the clean channels the crucible had prepared. The warlord roared, half in triumph, half in agony, and tried to tear free. They did not let him. Logan's next blow split Koul's remaining knee. Seth hacked away the last functioning hand at the wrist. A wolf guard, dying on his feet from a hole through the gut, staggered close enough to plant a crack charge directly into the cracked chest cavity before being torn apart by the backwash of Koul's thrashing. Seth grabbed the charge with his gauntlet and shoved it deeper into the wound up to the knuckles. Koul hit him hard enough to cave the side of his helm in. Logan took the Chaos Lord across the face with the flat of his axe and shattered one horn at the root. Seth yanked free and kicked the warlord in the split abdomen, forcing him another half-step deeper against the ruined seal and altar iron. The crack charge detonated inside him. Koul did not explode cleanly. He ruptured. Chest, back and side burst outward in a wet volcanic spray of armor shards, black blood, shattered ribs, and warp-lit organs. He was still alive after it, still trying to drag himself free with one remaining leg and the stump of a hand. Furnace light pouring out through what had once been his torso. That was why the kill could not be elegant. Seth leapt onto him like an execution beast unleashed, driving the chainsword down into the opened ruin and soaring through spine, lungs, whatever warp-thickened organs still clung there. Logan followed one step behind and one stroke above, hacking through gorget and neck as the warlord thrashed, pinning the body under converging blows. Koul tried to speak. The words came out as blood and fire. Seth tore sideways, opening the whole upper chest to the shoulder. Logan's axe fell again and again until the helm split. Seth buried the chain blade into the face beneath. Logan took the head almost off. Seth finished the work by tearing the remainder free in a burst of vertebrae, gristle, and smoking light. When it was over, nothing recognizable remained but ruin. Vorgath Koul lay hacked down into a mound of butchered armor, split meat, broken horns, and leaking warp glow that flickered weaker with every heartbeat. The altar chain behind him hung torn and useless. The ritual anchor was gone. For perhaps 1 second, the chamber held the shape of victory. Then the gore crucible began to die. Not quietly, not in retreat. The chained reactors below the chamber screamed as the broken seals fed contradictory loads back through the system. Furnace stacks ruptured. Blood channels reversed and geysered upward in boiling columns. The warp wound above the skull mound convulsed, drawing in air, ash, loose bodies and screaming demons before vomiting fire back out in great ragged tongues. Bells shattered, gantries tore loose. Pressure doors throughout the underhive slammed and burst in the same breath. Somewhere deep below, something vast gave way with a sound like a mountain's spine breaking. The whole underhive began to come down around them. The first thing that died was the chanting. It did not cease cleanly. It frayed. The metallic liturgy of the crucible's engines broke apart into stuttering pulses, into shrieks of overloaded pistons, and the cracked tolling of bells that had forgotten their own rhythm. Then the whole vast underhive began to convulse around the victory, as though the world itself rejected the thing that had been done within its throat. The wound above the altar did not close. It was too large, too fed, too ancient in appetite for that. But it buckled. Its swollen red-black circumference folded inward in violent spasms, dragging demons, back screaming into the bruise light, while others were torn in half against its collapsing edge. Winds birthed from impossible pressure changes raced through the chamber, sucking ash, loose shell casings, broken icons and bodies up toward the wound, only to hurl them back out again in bursts of fire and blood rain. The skull mountain beneath it split down the middle, thousands of bone relics and brass-fused corpses cascading into the abyss below, in a white torrent of grinning ruin. Logan Grimnar did not waste a heartbeat looking at Koul's remains. "Withdrawal," he voxed, his voice cutting through the madness with kingly finality. "Fighting order, no break, no scatter. We leave by the northern arteries. Long fangs last, wounded between packs. Move." That was command, not triumph, not relief. A world had been spared one damnation and was now descending into another. The work remained the same. Around him, wolves and flesh-tearers alike wrenched themselves free of the kill, and began the labor of survival. Demons still spilled in ragged knots from the shuddering warp wound. Bloodreapers, who had not yet understood their lord was truly dead, fought on in pockets of suicidal frenzy. The chamber floor cracked in widening seams, magma glare punching through the iron decking in strips of molten orange. Above and beyond, the chained reactors of Carthax screamed in failing harmony, pressure venting into the underworks in shrieks hot enough to blister ceramite. Seth stood over what had once been Vorgarth Koul and bled into the ruins. His armor was almost more red-black wound than plate now. The blow across his back had opened him nearly to the spine, and each movement left a darker trail, where blood sheeted down the broken seals of his armor and spattered the deck. One lens of his helm was gone entirely. His chainsword still ran, though it coughed on clot and fragments of bone. The flesh-tearers around him were no better. Enkiel was dead. Castor was dead. Many more were gone into the chamber's butchered ruin, mixed with the enemy so thoroughly that only gene seed retrieval would ever separate them. Seth looked at the warp wound, then at the dead, then toward the nearest escape artery. He did not ask whether they had won. That question belonged to men who had enough left of themselves to need comforting. "Move," he snarled to his surviving sons. One of them, Brother Malak, swayed where he stood. The warrior's right arm hung useless, broken at the shoulder. His helm grill clicked wetly with each breath. Seth seized him by the chest plate with one gauntlet and shoved him toward the tunnel mouth. "Walk, or I drag your corpse." Malak found his feet. That too was mercy of a kind. They withdrew into hell. The northern arteries had already begun to come apart by the time the rearguard reached them. Iron stairs twisted under seismic strain. Service bridges dropped away into smoke-lit depths. Coolant floods boiled along the lower channels where reactor feed lines had burst. The dead lay everywhere, not simply where they had fallen, but where the convulsing hive had thrown them, piled against blast doors, jammed into machinery, hung impaled on snapped railings and jagged braces. Every tunnel seemed to hold a new choice between two forms of death: stay and be buried, or run through fire and enemy knives toward another collapsing passage. Logan made those choices for everyone. He redeployed packs by instinct and absolute necessity, never allowing the withdrawal to become a rout. Grey hunters anchored intersections and fell back in disciplined sequence. Wolfguard took the worst choke points and held until the wounded and mortal survivors had passed. Long Fangs, nearly out of heavy ammunition, planted their last missiles on failing support columns and timed the collapses behind them to delay pursuit. Twice Logan ordered entire side tunnels sealed with demolition charges while loyal defenders were still fighting inside them, because to hesitate another moment would have fed the living behind them into the same grave. No one argued. There was no time and no point. At one collapsed transit artery, they found 70 Vulgaris line troopers trapped behind an overturned Munitorum hauler, while a knot of demons bounded toward them through steam and smoke. The men had fixed bayonets because they had nothing else left to fix. Grimnar took one look at the geometry of the kill, placed his wolves in a 2-tier firing wedge, and broke the demons in a storm of bolt detonations before finishing the survivors with blade work in the choke itself. Then, without so much as asking names, he ordered the guard troopers to take up the rear flank behind his leftmost pack and keep pace or die where they lagged. They obeyed him like men obeying a law of nature. Further back, Seth's withdrawal was uglier and more intimate. The flesh-tearers did not have the numbers left for elegant sequencing. They had will, rage, and the fact that their enemies were breaking as fast as they were. Any bloodreaper still foolish enough to stand in the retreat corridor died immediately and without waste. Seth killed one by driving his face into a blast door seam until the helm came apart. Another he simply shot through the chest and left twitching in a rising flood of blood and coolant. A third, some maddened remnant of Koul's chosen with one arm torn off and brass nails through both cheeks, leapt shrieking out of a maintenance shaft and took Seth in the side. Seth killed him with 3 short chain blade bursts and never slowed. The flesh-tearers followed because he kept moving. That was all that mattered. He was half ruined, bleeding enough to drown a mortal man several times over, but he still advanced through the retreat like a butcher walking to his next block. It gave shape to their own survival. As long as Seth remained upright, the chapter's surviving edge still had a direction. Behind them, the gore crucible continued to die in stages large enough to erase civilizations. The destruction of the ritual anchor had broken the rite. That much was certain. The warp wound above Carthax had been wounded as surely as Koul had, and the demonic pressure pouring through it began to lose coherence as the crucible's blood-fed order collapsed. But broken did not mean harmless. Whole hive levels below the capital vanished into fire when chained reactor cores vented plasma into the underworks. Others caved in entirely. Millions of tons of habsteel, shrine stone, and manufacturum mass dropping through lower levels in avalanches that crushed the living, the dead, and the damned alike. Demonic backlash rippled upward through districts already weakened by siege and sacrifice, bursting men into piles of wet meat, turning walls briefly transparent, lighting the eyes of corpses before they fell still forever. By the time Loyalist survey augurs could begin naming the damage, whole sectors of Hive Carthax were simply gone. So were the people inside them. The extraction from the underhive became an ascent through a dying machine. At every level, the cost was written more broadly. Entire guard regiments disappeared from the Vox between one check-in and the next. Armor battalions still fighting near the hive guns were swallowed when a curtain wall collapsed and took their firing terraces with it. Evacuation routes prepared too late by desperate command staff became kill lanes anyway when the wounded warp breach spasmed across them in waves of blind unreality. Servitors dragged lines of dead from medici stations only to join the piles themselves when the ceilings came down. Vulgaris was being saved only in the narrowest and cruelest sense. It would not become Koul's stable gate into damnation. It would remain a world of the Imperium. Those two truths were all victory meant. When the first survivors finally clawed out into upper hive daylight, the sky above, Carthax looked diseased. The warp wound had shrunk to a bleeding bruise high over the capital, its edges flickering weakly now, leaking lightning and demonic ash instead of whole hosts. Anti-air batteries still fired into it on reflex. Burning debris rained from the upper spires, where the convulsion had gutted old void shield towers and transit crowns. Entire city levels sagged or leaned, where their support routes had been cooked away underneath. Columns of smoke rose thick as mountain trunks. Through them all thundered the continuing artillery of the wider war, because enemy remnants still held out in fortress lines, and because there had never been any chance that killing Koul would make all his armies vanish like guilty thoughts. Logan emerged near the inner curtain wall, at the head of his rearguard, with less than half the warriors he had taken into the final descent. He began reorganizing the defense before the dust of the climb had settled from his armor. Packs were reassigned. Ammunition was redistributed from the dead. Fire support was redirected against isolated enemy pockets, trying to exploit the collapse. A guard colonel stood nearby, one sleeve empty, face half-skinned by a near miss, and watched the great wolf work with the sort of awe men reserved for creatures they knew they would never fully understand. "I saw him in the breach at Gathan," the colonel said to no one in particular, though several wounded troopers listened anyway. Saw him kill that engine with his own hand. Thought it was lies until I saw it. Throne of Terror, the old bastard fights like a saga wearing armor. Another trooper, younger and still shaking from shock, laughed weakly through cracked lips. Then may the All-Father send him back whenever hell opens under our boots again. Not far from them, a medici crew tried to approach Seth, where he stood amid the surviving flesh-tearers near a blackened transit arch. They came to a halt before truly reaching him. Something in the sight of the chapter master, blood-caked and silent, and staring through one ruined lens at the burning city, convinced them that an extra few meters of distance was wisdom bought dearly. A wounded lieutenant of the Vulgaris line, arm in a sling and face grey beneath soot, glanced once toward Seth, and then away again. "Did he save us?" one of the medici orderlies whispered. The lieutenant watched Seth tear the helm off a dying bloodreaper, dragged from a rubble heap, and crush the traitor's throat bare-handed, before turning away without a word. "Yes," the lieutenant said. Then, after a pause, "And I thank the Emperor, I shall likely never have to stand near him again." That was the truth of Gabriel Seth in the mouths of ordinary men. Gratitude without comfort. Salvation with the smell of a slaughterhouse still on it. Hours later, when the immediate fires had been cut away from the command approaches and the surviving command staff could breathe, without inhaling pure dust and death, the two chapter masters met once more on a broken bastion overlook above the inner city. Below them, Carthax burned in bands and columns. Far beyond, through the ash wastes and the corpse-littered trench belts, guard formations and surviving wolves were still hunting enemy remnants by flare light and muzzle flash. Thunderhawks passed low overhead, dragging smoke. Servitors and labor gangs already moved among the rubble fields, with corpse loaders and gene seed retrieval units. The war had changed shape. It had not ended. Seth came to the overlook stripped of his helm, the ruin in his back temporarily sealed by emergency staples and pressure foam under a rough drape of torn cloak. Grimnar stood waiting in battered armor darkened by soot. One pauldron split almost through, pelts burned at the edges. Neither man had been made gentler by survival. "The beast is dead," Grimnar said. Seth looked out over the burning city. "There will be another." Aye. That single word held the whole Imperium in it. For a while they said nothing more. They did not need to. Both had looked into the same throat and seen what the other was under pressure no title could soften. At last, Seth turned his head a fraction. "You chose well below." Grimnar's expression did not change. "I chose the weapon already nearest the kill." It was not modesty. It was not insult. It was the clean truth. Seth gave the barest nod. "Good." Grimnar studied him with that cold old eye. "You are still standing. So are you." A moment later, Seth added, "Do not mistake that for affection." The ghost of a snarl touched Grimnar's mouth. "I would sooner mistake a knife for a priest." That was as close to understanding as they would ever need. No brotherhood was declared. No oath of future alliance was sworn. The galaxy had no use for such comforting lies between men like them. They had met in war, found one another, worthy in the only coin that mattered, and would now leave in different directions to continue the same endless labor under different skies. The Space Wolves departed first. Their strike craft rose through the bruised atmosphere in squadrons of iron and flame, carrying the living, the gene seed of the dead, and enough wounded to fill every hold twice over. Logan left behind a cordon of Imperial Navy fire and guard pursuit lines already closing around the surviving bloodreaper redoubts, then took his sons toward the void. There would be another hunt. There was always another hunt. Somewhere a different world was already beginning to die. Somewhere another warlord already believed himself inevitable. Gabriel Seth lingered longer on Vulgaris, though not from pity. The flesh-tearers had come to spend blood, and they had. They left with fewer warriors than they had brought, fewer voices on the pack channels, fewer helms stacked in the armorium shrines. Yet the chapter's hunger had been spent, for now, against enemies beyond all question. For Seth, that counted as a kind of mercy. His sons boarded in silence, broken but controlled, the chain drawn tight once more after coming near to snapping in the dark. When at last Seth's strike cruiser lifted from the burning world, he did not look back with tenderness. He looked back as a butcher might regard an emptied slaughter floor. Work done, cost counted, no joy in either measure. Vulgaris remained, not whole, never that, but it remained. Its skies were still bruised and red with fire when the chanting began. Not the chanting of Koul's engines, not the metallic liturgy of the damned. Human voices, millions fewer than before, yet enough to carry. In the shattered hab levels and among the trench belts turned to grave fields, survivors gathered amid rubble, pyres, and the rising stink of mass burial. Priests led hymns, soldiers with one arm, no legs, blinded eyes and half-burned lungs joined in when they could. Factory workers and labor serfs who had hidden in vent crawls or corpse vaults stumbled out into the ruin and shouted praise to the Emperor over open pits already filling with their dead. Victory, they called it. And perhaps, by the standards of the age, it was. Around them, corpse loaders trundled on their tracks, hauling mountains of bodies toward render plants now returned to loyal use. Mass graves spread in rows beneath the broken walls of Carthax. Gunfire still flashed on the far horizons, where remnants were being exterminated. Smoke climbed unbroken into the poisoned heavens. Above it all, beyond the atmosphere and the ash, and the wounded halo left by the dying warp breach, the stars burned cold and innumerable. They did not promise peace. They promised only distance. And in the grim dark between them, there was room enough for 10,000 more Vulgarises to burn, for 10,000 more Kouls to rise, and for men like Logan Grimnar and Gabriel Seth to answer those fires, until they too were finally consumed. Below that bruised sky, over the graves of millions, the survivors of Vulgaris kept chanting anyway,